Good afternoon. I'd like to call the City Council meeting of June 28th, 2016 to order. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please call the roll.
Councilmember Dominguez? Present. Councilmember Hart? Here. Councilmember Hotchkiss? Here. Councilmember Murillo? Here. Councilmember Rouse? Here. Councilmember White? Not present. Mayor Schneider?
Here. Any changes to the agenda? No? Okay. Public comment. I have 2 minutes here at the podium, and we'll start with Paulina Kahn to be followed by Michael Baker. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mayor and City Council. Before you have a packet which I gave. I'm asking you to please reverse your vote to accept the Highway Bridge program funds for the Mission Creek Historic Landmark Bridge that no one in the community wanted touched. This is a waste of money and also a waste of historic integrity. The bridge inspection of 2013 said it was in very good condition. It got an 8 out of 10 rating. The bridge is one of the many designated historic landmarks in the area. Please see the first attachment. Mission Historic Park and Rocky Nook Park both have deed restrictions for use as a park only, not as a road right-of-way. See second and third attachments. The last attachment is for APS, how it could be configured to provide traffic flow and comfort to all. There are a series of ideas in the packet. See photos in the comments. How a crosswalk can be put at West Mountain Drive. See how a Winky Blink pedestrian push-button crosswalk sign could be put at Puesta del Sol to cross Mission Canyon Road. With asphalt paint, we could paint the western shoulder down Mission Canyon Road between Puesta del Sol and Las Encinas to the 11-foot wide vehicle corridor. That will help keep vehicles in the corridor instead of taking that corner too fast. Keep the hedge at 653 Mission Canyon Road trimmed to the middle of the boulders so no roadway signs are covered up. Traffic would flow, pedestrians and bicycles would feel more comfortable, historic resources would be saved, cost would be minimal, controversy avoided. Please vote again to give back the Highway Bridge program funds. They are not appropriate for this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Baker?
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. My name is Michael Baker, CEO for United Boys and Girls Clubs here in Santa Barbara County. I just want to give you an update. We're in summer, and we are slammed with kids, which is a good thing, which is where you want them. We actually, from this past year from 2015 to 2016, we've seen a positive trend. We have a 50% increase in our average daily attendance at our West Side Club, which is a great thing. We're collaborating with several agencies, such as the Dance Academy, Ballet Academy, Squire Foundation, and there's several other organizations that we're working with on a daily and weekly basis. One of the areas I wanted to really highlight for you is that the Family Services Agency, we've collaborated with them, and they're going to actually be providing 12 hours per week of free licensed counseling for our families. Again, that's going to happen at the West Side Club. It's a partnership that we developed, and that's going to happen starting next week. So that's something we're very excited about, and something I know near and dear to Councilmember Hotchkiss' heart because he attended the ceremony when we had the silver card ceremony at our West Side Club. Give you the latest updates. We now have 61 of our members have achieved their silver card status. That means they've attended the Boys and Girls Club this calendar year from January to now at least 52 times. Even more profound is that 34 members have achieved the gold card status, which means that they've attended the club 105 times already this year. Studies have shown, and I mentioned to you before, that we know that children are twice as likely to graduate high school in time if they attend a Boys and Girls Club program 105 times in the calendar year. We're already there, and we're finishing up the first half of the year. So we're going to have to come up with another card ceremony for platinum or something. We'll figure something out, but it's a good problem to have, and I want to continue to thank each and every one of you for your support. It's making a big difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great. Okay, that concludes public comment, and we're on to the consent calendar. You have some items to read.
Item 10, acquisition of easement for public purposes for the Quantarino Street Permeable Pavers Project, 530.04. Recommendation the council adopt by reading of title only a resolution of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara to acquire and accept an easement for public purposes at 721 East Coda Street, APN 031110004 for for the Low Impact Development Demonstration Streets, Sidewalks, and Alleys Project Phase 2, and authorizing the Public Works Director to execute the agreement for acquisition of the public right-of-way for public purposes, no-cost acquisition, and related easement acquisition documents, subject to approval as to form by the City Attorney, and consenting to the recordation of the easement deed in the official records of the County of Santa Barbara. And item 12, subject records destruction for Community Development Department, 160.06, recommendation that council adopt by reading of title only a resolution of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara relating to the destruction of records held by the Community Development Department, Administration, Housing and Human Services, and Building and Safety Divisions.
Thank you. Without further objection, we'll waive further reading. Anyone need to take an item off the consent calendar? I just had one quick comment on item 11, which is the Memorandum of Understanding with the Community Action Commission for the South Coast Task Force. The full title is the South Coast Task Force on Youth Safety, so I just want to make sure our MOU has the correct title in it, so we're not, okay. I'm seeing nods. Okay. Anything else, or is there a motion for the consent calendar? There is. Okay. Moved by Hotchkiss, second by White. All in favor? Aye. Aye. Okay, that's unanimous. And then report from the Finance Committee, Mr. Hart.
Madam Mayor, the Finance Committee met today to talk again about the city's infrastructure needs, and we reviewed some of the projected costs over a 20-year horizon for investments in street capital and storm drains and street lighting in the police department, and also very briefly considered a number of different financing revenue options, and we'll continue that conversation, I think, to July 26th, I think. And we'll be bringing that information, I think, to the council later in the fall, perhaps, or late summer.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Item number 18.
Item 18, subject marijuana business tax ballot measure, the Santa Barbara Marijuana Control Act, 110.03. Recommendation that council adopt by reading of title only and unanimous vote a resolution of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara calling and giving notice of a consolidated special municipal election to be held in the City of Santa Barbara on Tuesday, November 8, 2016, for the submission of a ballot measure to the voters of the city pertaining to an enactment of a general tax on the gross receipt of marijuana businesses.
Thank you. Is it Mr. Smart, Mr. Kalan? Mr. Kalan.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, it will be both of us. The finance director, Mr. Samario, and I worked closely since May 24th to put this package together. You'll see on the slide up there what we want to cover. A little bit of background, very little. Then we need to talk about the tax approval process. The policy and legal questions. We mentioned in the staff report, and I'll emphasize that the city administrator and I made a number of assumptions about the council's policy choices. Those are up to you to decide and test. We've made special arrangements with the city clerk so that we can edit up on the screen in real time the ballot label or any component of the resolution that the council feels needs editing. So let's move right into the background. Going back to 2010, the council approved the storefront medical marijuana ordinance at that time. Under state law in 2010 and up until the end of 2015, medical marijuana dispensaries had to operate under a collective or cooperative model. So in 2010, the council did not consider and, frankly, I think did not anticipate the prospect of taxing medical marijuana. Move ahead to 2015, the Upper State Street dispensary was approved. Also in 2015, the state law amendments, which caused us last November to bring council some recommendations about looking at zoning for personal cultivation, those state law amendments effectively commercialized medical marijuana by dividing the industry up into a number of categories and expressly contemplating money changing hands during that process. That wasn't the case prior to 2015. It was allowed. Money could change hands prior to 2015, but there wasn't a legal structure that contemplated it as there is now. 2016, just recently, council approved the Milpas dispensary. 2016 as well, we mentioned briefly when we spoke to you in May about regulatory issues that the Adult Use of Marijuana Act initiative has submitted quite a few signatures, 600,000 signatures, will likely be on the November 16 ballot. That measure legalizes the use of non-medical marijuana for adults 21 years of age and older, and we'll get into how it affects taxation as we get into the program. Finally, on the 24th, you directed us unanimously to look at a tax measure. Let's talk about the legal process for tax approval. General taxes, of course, require simple majority voter approval. And the best way to understand what a general tax is to understand what a special tax is. A special tax is a tax earmarked for a specific purpose or placed into a specific fund. In other words, money that is dedicated to a special purpose. Those kinds of taxes require 2/3 vote. A general tax, which is put into the general fund and funds general city services, requires only majority voter approval. But the Constitution adds a wrinkle for the approval of general taxes, and that is city councils must place general tax measures on the same ballot as council members are elected. If you choose not to do that, if you choose to go forward in November of 2016, the state constitution requires the council by a unanimous vote to make an emergency declaration. Now, the law is very thin there. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But what constitutes an emergency is a question that really hasn't been tested by the courts. Okay, there are about 6 policy and election-related questions that are in front of the council today. There may be more. These are the big ones that we tried to distill from the report and the taxing measures. The first is the taxing model. How does the structure work? Secondly is who will pay the tax. Third, the tax rates, the revenue projections, the ballot label, which is the language that actually appears on the ballot. That is a city council drafted document. I've made some recommendations in the resolution along with Mr. Casey, but that ultimately is a city council document. And finally, the designation of who will prepare ballot arguments and rebuttal arguments. Okay, the tax model. Being a general tax, the purpose of the tax is expressly stated as being to generate revenue. This is not a regulatory measure. The city's other regulatory powers remain intact, including the ability to impose regulatory fees if necessary related to medical or non-medical marijuana. Really, for convenience, we followed the format of our existing business tax ordinance, Chapter 504 of the Municipal Code. And the idea there was to have some familiarity for the administrative staff who are involved and for the business community that might be involved. Finally, the tax is structured to tax the gross receipts from marijuana transactions. That would include sales and services, and it's very broadly defined to cover virtually everything related to marijuana. Okay, who are the proposed taxpayers? This is an important distinction for the council and the community to understand. The proposed measure imposes a tax on businesses, not on the consumers of marijuana. And that is significant both for the administrative aspect of how we go about collecting the tax, but also for the economic consequence of where that cost will fall. We've often heard in the context of land development the argument that development fees increase the ultimate cost of housing. If you think about it from an economic standpoint, that's kind of a fictitious argument. The market sets the price for the commodity, whether it's a house or marijuana, and taxes or fees cut into the profit margin of the business, not the end user's price. Where there is sensitivity with respect to the tax rate is whether an illegal marijuana market will continue to exist if the Adult Use of Marijuana Act legalizes non-medical marijuana. So the council may have some sensitivity about not wanting to tax marijuana so heavily that it drives the market underground. Although the ordinance as proposed to you today does cover illegal marijuana sales as well as legal marijuana sales, and it expressly does not make them legal simply because they pay the tax, very much like the situation we have with vacation rentals at the present time. The ballot measure policy question with respect to who gets taxed also includes a recommendation from the city administrator that we tax both medical and non-medical marijuana. The assumption here is that the Adult Use of Marijuana Act is very likely to pass. We mentioned in the staff report that in 2015 it was polling in the neighborhood of 50% legalization was. By April of 2016 it was polling closer to 60%. And with 600,000 signatures submitted, it's a virtual certainty that that measure will be on the ballot this fall and that it will be successful. So we will have, in all likelihood, to deal with non-medical marijuana sales in Santa Barbara. Now, there are a couple of caveats there. First of all, the council has not made policy choices about how to regulate the sale of non-medical marijuana. One of the premises in the resolution before you today is the legal conclusion that if you do nothing between now and November, non-medical marijuana uses will be able to come into the city as generalized retail types of operations. So the safest legal stance to take with respect to non-medical marijuana is that the council needs to take some form of zoning action to restrict or regulate non-medical marijuana. That's an important premise behind the rationale for suggesting that the tax extend to non-medical marijuana as well as medical. The tax rates proposed are 10% of gross receipts for medical marijuana and 20% for non-medical. There is no magic in those numbers. I'll turn this over to Mr. Samario in a moment. He can talk to you about the revenue generation and the comparability of those rates to what else is going on in the state. I would offer just one closing remark before I turn it over to Mr. Samario with respect to non-medical marijuana. The ordinances that we looked at around the state were not drafted at a time when legalization of non-medical marijuana was contemplated. So the rates in those ordinances are really designed around the prospect that marijuana was serving seriously ill patients who needed it for their health and safety, essentially. That's not going to be the case come November if the AUMA passes. So when you're considering the tax rates, you have a different job, in my view, than the cities who have come before us in establishing marijuana taxes, because it would be timely and appropriate for you to expressly consider how non-medical marijuana fits into the picture.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of council. Bob Samario, Finance Director. So we looked at other communities, what they have done over the last several years, and you can see the list here of some cities in the state in the range of tax rates that they've imposed. For the most part, the focus was on medical marijuana. So Santa Cruz, for example, 7%. Palm Springs, 10% for those permitted dispensaries, but 15% for non-permitted dispensaries or any sales. San Jose is the highest, one of the highest at 10%. And then Sacramento at 4%, although they're considering raising that for non-medical marijuana purposes to, I think, 10%, or something in between 4 and 10. And then Oakland is currently at 5%. So the adult use of did you want to cover this? Or okay, so the Adult Use of Medical Marijuana Act, the tax structure, it would be a 15% excise tax. So again, to distinguish between a sort of a sales tax, it's going to be an excise tax on the sales proceeds. This measure would exempt medical marijuana from the current sales tax that's applied. So, for example, the county of Santa Barbara, we have a sales tax rate of 8%. Under this initiative, if passed, the medical marijuana would be no longer taxed at 8%. But it does allow for local taxes. So we looked at those communities statewide, and we talked to them and asked them, one, what the rate was, how many dispensaries they have, and what current revenues they're generating from those. And we made an estimate using some averages about how much in gross proceeds was being generated by dispensary. And so we extrapolated that to come up with what we expect to be generating from our three, once they're fully permitted and operational, 3 dispensaries, using a 10% medical marijuana tax and 20% non-medical marijuana tax. So the estimated gross proceeds of those 3 dispensaries is about $5.5 million. So that would generate about $550,000 per year. And on top of that, if we had other revenues coming from non-medical marijuana, and I essentially assume that we're going to see a doubling of those revenues from non-medical sources. So it's just a big assumption. We have to come up with some estimates. So I just doubled the number, and so it's another $5.5 million in estimated gross proceeds. But at a 20% rate, that would generate about $1.1 million. So theoretically, what we're assuming and estimating is that estimated gross rates for both medical and non-medical will be about $10 million, generating $1.65 million per year. This is giving you sort of a menu of rates and what the implications of that might be. So if we wanted to do a 5, 10, or 15, 20% rate, you could see that essentially a 5% rate would generate about $275,000 for both medical and non-medical. 10% would be double that, or $550,000, and 15%, $825,000 for each of those, and then up to $1.1 million at 20%. You can see I bolded what staff's recommended, at least at this point, for medical and non-medical.
Okay, thank you. Let me jump to the ballot label considerations, and I'll put the ballot label up on the screen on the next slide. The ballot label, again, is the question presented to the voters on the actual ballot. And the reason we have concern for that is unfortunate, frankly, and that is the assumption that most voters, or many voters, will not read more than the ballot itself. The ballot label is limited to 75 words. State law constrains how we frame that question. So it has to begin, shall the ordinance, and it has to end, to be adopted. That may not be the clearest way to state the question, but we're stuck with it. Finally, beginning January 1 of this year, new state legislation came into effect. It was a bill sponsored by the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association last year, and I mention that only because it gives you a sense of the sentiment behind the bill. And that bill requires cities to, within that 75-word limit, include a statement about the tax rate, the projected annual revenue, and the duration of the tax. Now, I listed that as an assumption in the beginning of the CAR because there is an argument yet untested that this law doesn't apply to chartered cities like Santa Barbara. From my perspective, I see little reason to advise council to risk that question if we can live with the requirements of it. And frankly, there is something to be said for fully informing the voters about the financial consequences of a tax. Okay, there's the proposed ballot label. I'll give a second to look at it. Perhaps the hardest thing for us to do as staff was come up with a title. And I'm not in the business of marketing taxes. The council may have different feelings about what it should be called. I believe it's an accurate title because, as we'll get into in a minute with respect to the emergency declaration, the city, and indeed all cities in California, are going to be faced with a heavy burden of enforcing and regulating state law, either under last year's amendments with respect to medical marijuana or the potential changes in state law brought by the Adult Use of Marijuana Act. So controlling marijuana is not meant to imply anything negative about medical or non-medical use of marijuana. It's meant to recognize that the state is creating a regulatory structure, either directly through the legislature or indirectly through the legislature or directly through the voters, that will require the city to exercise a tremendous amount of control in areas where it currently is neither funded nor informed, really, about what regulatory requirements are going to be necessary. The second part of the measure makes it clear that this is to fund general city services. It's not being earmarked for police stations or roads or anything like that. We are allowed, in my opinion, to identify some of the general city services that would be paid for with this tax. And so the listing of crime prevention, police services, and zoning enforcement is meant to recognize that those are some of the services that would be paid for out of the general fund using these revenues. Finally, in deference to the Howard Jarvis measure, the ballot title includes the tax rates, the estimated revenue generation, and the fact that the council would not be proposing a termination date or an ending sunset clause for this tax if you opt for staff's recommendations. As I mentioned at the outset, we can come back to that ballot label. The city clerk can edit that in real time if council feels like that's appropriate. For now, I want to move on to a couple of details in the elections code that are important. First, as written, the resolution authorizes the mayor to draft the ballot argument on behalf of the city council. There was no creativity in that choice. That's what you did in 2008 for the utility users tax. There is no requirement that the mayor be the draftsperson. I would caution that if you designate a council committee, you need to assume that that drafting process is going to be open and public noticed meetings. So it can be awkward if a committee is created to draft a ballot argument. The resolution and state law would allow up to 4 additional signatories to the mayor's ballot argument. Let's move on to the emergency declaration. As I mentioned earlier, it's constitutionally required and also has to be approved by a unanimous vote of the council. It's not been tested by the courts, though, so no one really knows what the voters intended when Proposition 218 added the requirement that a council declare an emergency before asking the voters to impose a general tax in a non-city council election year. We really don't know what was intended. Many cities have interpreted that to mean a fiscal emergency, and that's certainly one way to look at it. What I've proposed here in conjunction with Mr. Casey is kind of a broader view of what constitutes the emergency that warrants going to the voters in an off year. In looking at this section, I don't think either the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association that drafted Prop 218 or the courts have very high standards for what an emergency declaration ought to be. By that, I mean they are relying on the voters to police taxation through Prop 218, and that will happen this November as well as it would in November of 2017. So I'm not terribly concerned about the emergency findings, but they need to be truthful and direct in my view. So the declaration in the resolution in front of you is founded on 2 basic points. 1, the city's financial needs, and 2, the costs of enforcement and regulation of both medical and non-medical marijuana. Let's look at those findings in a little more detail. The first conclusion that this resolution would have the City Council making is that taken together, the city does not currently have sufficient funding to meet the needs described on that slide. I believe that statement is accurate. It is, however, a public declaration, and it's up to the council whether to make that conclusion. I think that it's reasonably inferred from the work you've done on infrastructure, from what we know about future city budgets as well as the current city budget, that when you take into account operating capital and reserve needs, there is definitely a shortfall in the city's revenue picture. Secondly, with respect to medical marijuana, the declaration reaches the conclusion that medical dispensaries will require the city to spend substantial sums of money currently unavailable to fund those services described up on the slide. Services related to financial record monitoring dispensary premises, and monitoring membership records. The honest truth here is that we don't know how much secondary impact dispensaries themselves will have on their neighbors. We can infer from the council's ordinance that there was concern about schools and other kinds of sensitive neighboring land uses, enough to warrant putting distance limitations on those dispensaries. But we don't really know whether they're going to be a high consumer of traditional police patrol services. We do know that they will, however, be consumers of staff time for police and community development, and indirectly for finance, going through the annual auditing process. And as we've mentioned before, I think it will be incumbent on the city to very aggressively audit and inspect the medical dispensaries as they open within a relatively short period of time, because there is not a book of rules. There is not a state published list of guidelines. There are not clearly established regulations for how to run a medical marijuana business, how to account for the money, how to account for the marijuana, how to account for the patients that come into the dispensary to get the marijuana. So we're going to have to make all that up, and we'll spend a lot of money figuring out how to do that. The second impact statement relates to non-medical marijuana. Should it be legalized by the AUMA? The term there is integrating and protecting health and safety needs with the untested state regulatory structure. Again, we're dealing in unknowns. Having studied the initiative fairly closely, it's better than where we were after the 1996 Compassionate Use Act initiative, and it's better than where we were after the Medical Marijuana Program Act that the legislature passed 10 or so years ago to try and explain better how to run these businesses. Nonetheless, we're going to be making it up as we go when we have legalized non-medical marijuana in California, and that burden will fall primarily on cities. So those impacts remain to be addressed should legalization happen. Finally, and this part may be the most controversial, the resolution closes the loop on the logic of needing the tax to go into effect in November or after 2016, and the proposed effective date, by the way, would be March 1, 2017. But the resolution closes the logical loop between those health and safety impacts and the regulatory burden by trying to identify some of the health and safety concerns that the city might have. So the resolution concludes that medical and non-medical marijuana dispensaries pose a direct health and safety threat that needs to be addressed by the community. Now, when we say health and safety, we don't need to blow that up into an overstated, exaggerated kind of picture of gloom and doom. Health and safety, protecting the health and safety, is the basic function of municipal government, and it comes in a lot of forms. Everything from controlling the height of a building to regulating how and when vendors can sell things on the street. So health and safety doesn't necessarily mean that you are anticipating terrible things to come from the legalization of marijuana or the sale of medical marijuana. Where it gets a little more graphic is in the next slide. And because the council will own this, I wanted to be very explicit about it. And I've tried here to avoid any value judgments. I've tried to rely on facts. And certainly illegal marijuana sales and distribution are a health and safety concern in the same manner that the unlawful distribution of any intoxicating substance is a health and safety concern. The Adult Use of Marijuana Act is specifically designed and intended to keep marijuana out of the hands of people younger than 21. And the reasons for that are important. The reasons have to do with the unusual impacts on children from excessive use of marijuana. So what this resolution does is really borrow from the rationale for the Adult Use of the Adult Use of Marijuana Act, which of course has among its sponsors the Lieutenant Governor. So it borrows from the rationale about keeping marijuana out of the hands of people who are too young to manage its use properly and young enough that they might be physically injured by marijuana in a way different than adults are when they use it. So this slide recites the American Psychological Association conclusions that frequent marijuana use can have a significant negative effect on the brains of teenagers and young adults. Third, the health and safety impact that we will be directly concerned with in finance and police is financial fraud by dispensaries and marijuana businesses. The structure of your storefront medical marijuana ordinance is the collective and cooperative model. I have openly criticized that before you a few times only because I think that's a very difficult structure to make work in the real world. It presumes that all the marijuana comes from the membership of the co-op or collective and presumes that the members of the co-op and collective pay exactly the amount necessary to cover the costs of those operations without any profit. In that context, it is difficult to understand how anyone could make a marijuana cooperative or collective function on a storefront level. So again, the 2010 ordinance and indeed state law was premised on really a fiction that might have been applicable more to kind of a communal operation than a commercial operation, which is what we have post-2015. So financial fraud's a real issue. Membership fraud's a real issue as well. The AUMA prohibits the association of certain categories of felons with marijuana distribution. That's a concern that we will need to police. That the state is not going to police that. Your police department will, and that's going to cost time and money. Finally, we have the problems of mobile marijuana distribution and marijuana cultivation. You've taken a step on marijuana cultivation by permitting it for personal use at residences. We will still have the obligation to enforce against illegal marijuana grows, whether they are commercial or personal, larger than the 100 square feet you allowed. So those health and safety factors are the points that support the emergency declaration. They are manifestly political, and the council will own those, not the city administrator, not the city attorney. So I'm emphasizing them. That's all.
We do have a couple of public comment speakers. Why don't we just do those, and then we can get to questions and details. We'll start with Robert Burke and then Courtney Caswell-Payton. Good afternoon.
Hello. Madam Mayor, members. The City Council is considering whether to tax marijuana stores to place an item on the ballot for November. The city staff and attorney have parsed the issue, especially using precedents from other municipalities. While the presentation is well focused on salient legal issues, what is left out is the people, the consumers. When it comes to items with a special tax on them, 3 items come to my mind: alcohol, cigarettes, and gasoline. The tax for gasoline is used to fix and repair roads, a related project. The tax on liquor and cigarettes is often referred to as a sin or a luxury tax. There is no specific project that the tax dollars go to benefit the public that I'm aware of. So too with the proposed marijuana tax. Marijuana for years has suffered a pejorative history. It is still a crime in many states and the federal government. Many label marijuana users with demonizing names such as doper or pothead. Segregation of marijuana into the same category as alcohol and cigarettes lumps them all with the same frowned upon status. To place marijuana in the same category as a sin or a luxury tax, cigarettes and alcohol, is to place it in a category of yet still shunned behavior. People who go to a marijuana facility will still feel the stigma of being a drug user rather than seeking relief from the medical plant for a physical problem. A special tax on marijuana stores, especially on the gross receipts, instills yet a social stigma upon the medical marijuana users that violates the equal protection clauses that causes harm to those who have the full faith and support of the state of California to do so. I urge you to send this to the Measure P Committee for further study for violation of Municipal Code Section 9.145.060. I urge you to reject this at this time the proposal for the November ballot. Madam Mayor, members.
Courtney Payton, come on up. And then it'll be Bonnie Raisin and then Lucille Boss Ramirez. And Courtney, you can use that lower microphone right there. There you go.
I've lived here since 1998. I miss the colorful, vibrant flavor of the Santa Barbara that I thought I was going to retire in. Now, since 2006, I've noticed an uprise in crime. I feel that this is due to things like the pot dispensaries. While I realize I cannot control others' behavior, as a citizen here, I feel that we should not allow pot dispensaries to be public storefronts in our community. We should instead refer them to worthy physicians who can prescribe it to them privately. That would also cut down on their stigma. It would also prevent innocent citizens from getting caught in criminal crossfires that they did not intend, such as white-collar crime. When people don't want drugs in their community because they're afraid of violence, they counterfeit, and they don't always pay for their drugs. And then innocent citizens who have nothing to do with drugs end up getting charges and end up getting sent to jail. I would prefer, as a business owner and former business owner in this community who is a member of Chamber of Commerce, to see the community look at this as an artistic reservoir of culture and of tourism, and to shut it down as private property, as to not violate the security of the celebrities who have worked here and the citizens who have soaked in hard-earned real dollars into the community. And I would prefer to see these storefronts used as entrepreneurial havens. Perhaps maybe the city can come up with something like cutting down one pot dispensary, leaving maybe one or two open for the people that can't get to a doctor who will prescribe it to them as a physician, and then using the one that is closed as a revolving entrepreneurial investment space. So you would choose an entrepreneur of the community and allow them to have storefront space to sell their legal products in the community.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bonnie Raisin.
I'm Bonnie Raisin. Good afternoon. Regarding the proposal to place a tax, an initiative on the ballot that would tax marijuana, medical marijuana, I am opposed. I have been opposed to the medical marijuana dispensaries from the beginning. However, seeing that that has become a reality, I definitely believe that medical marijuana should be taxed, as should the sale of non-medical marijuana. The American Medical Association, for whatever reasons, and I explored it at one time, should be sanctioning, in my opinion, the use of medical marijuana. They do not. They do not. They're not involved with that. So we have dispensaries all over, which I definitely have opposed and still do. I think that, like alcohol and cigarettes, marijuana needs to be taxed. It is a quote unquote a privilege, perhaps, at least for the non-medical marijuana users, and it is a gateway drug, in my opinion, and I believe that that is shared by a great majority of the medical profession as well as citizens across the United States. 21 is an arbitrary cutoff date, as we all know, for drugs and alcohol, or for marijuana and alcohol. So I am in favor of imposing a tax on both medical and non-medical marijuana, and I think that it will not only generate more revenue for the city, it will send a message that the city is aware of the usage of both. Thank you very much.
Lucille Boss Ramirez.
Good afternoon, Honorable Mayor and Council members. My name is Lucille Boss Ramirez, and as a member of CEASE, the coalition engaged in a smoke-free effort, I'd like to comment on issues related to the Santa Barbara Marijuana Control Act. Since 1989, CEASE has advocated for strong tobacco and secondhand smoke policies throughout the county. It is critical to recognize that smoke is smoke. The new California tobacco law expands the definition of smoking to include the use of an electronic smoking device, whether or not it contains nicotine. This new definition of smoking includes marijuana smoking, including medical marijuana, and I do have a fact sheet to distribute on the updated laws. New laws treat vapes and e-cigarettes like tobacco products. Many people smoke and use marijuana from these devices in public. Given the new laws, now is an ideal time to examine the city's 2 tobacco-related policies and align them with local and regional ones. I also have a fact sheet including grades from other cities for you. Many cities throughout California that are similar to Santa Barbara have already adopted outdoor policies to protect the public. A disturbing fact about our California coastline: the city of Santa Barbara is one of the only municipal beaches without any smoking restrictions. This type of law should protect people from smoke and vapor exposure while living, working, and recreating. A citywide ordinance, rather than zone-specific, is ideal for policy implementation and enforcement. Thank you for considering this information as you move forward.
Okay, that concludes public comment, and it's to the council. I imagine we have a number of questions to go start. Or not. Okay, Mr. Hart.
Well, I noted the city attorney mentioning that we need to update our zoning ordinance to address non-medical marijuana retail outlets. And I think Ms. Boss Ramirez's point about the smoking regulations sort of fit in that category too. So I think in addition to us taking this action to tax marijuana in relation to medical marijuana dispensaries and as well as non-medical marijuana, if the state initiative passes, we do need to have on our workload the zoning work that the city attorney referenced and an update of our smoking regulations. I think there's a timetable now. There's a deadline that these things need to be in place by. And, this is really kind of the first step in that effort, but those other steps are essential as well. And just as a technical point, I noticed on slide 18, the description of the emergency declaration for medical impacts doesn't actually say medical marijuana dispensaries, and it probably needs to have that word. It just says approved medical dispensaries. It may be understood within the context of it, but I think it probably just is just a typo.
And we are still coming back to council on some of these zoning and other regulatory issues, right? That's still pending.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, you gave us direction, I believe, on May 17th to come back. We are actively working on that as staff. They are not easy issues. It's going to be a rush to get them done by November. So you might expect that we will paint with the broader brush initially and come back for refinement through a broader community process on those regulations.
Great. And I know there was also, go ahead, Mr. Casey.
Yeah, Madam Mayor and council members, and also on the smoking policy, you asked us to bring back some ideas for taking a fresh look at our smoking policy. So that'll be coming back to the full council as well.
So that's already in process. So we don't need to do any further direction. That's already in process. Okay. Mr. Hart, did you have something else?
Well, just for my clarity, you said the effective date of the initiative is March 1st of 2017?
Councilmember Hart, the effective date of the proposed taxing measure is March 1, 2017.
Okay. Do we know when the effective date of the state initiative is?
I don't remember off the top of my head, but I'll look right now and I can get back to you.
I guess that is the critical point when we need to have the smoking regulations in place, in my mind. So,
okay, Ms. Murillo.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I do support going forward with this. Thank you for your good work, Mr. Kalan and Mr. Samario. That's interesting to hear you opine that it'll be on the ballot and it'll be passed. So we really do need to, thank you, be prepared for that. And the only thing I'll add, I'm so glad that we are looking at updating policies related to smoking in public. I know vaping is an issue. Certainly smoking on our beaches should be part of the discussion when it comes back. And then, in terms of our young people, anyone under age 21, I have started conversations with CADA and the Youth Council to have a discussion. What will it mean to our teenagers if marijuana becomes legal? They can get it now, frankly, in the schoolyard and other places. But it's a new chapter for parents, I think, and our school system, and us, and those of us who work with in the youth community. We need to talk to our young people about, like we talk to them about alcohol and other drugs, marijuana is going to have a different kind of presence in the community, and we are looking at that. And I'm so glad that the CADA, the Council on Alcoholism and Drug Abuse, folks are willing to have a discussion with me on that. So thanks.
Mr. Dominguez.
I wanted to ask a question of the city attorney regarding the ballot label. And I wanted to clarify, first off, this is going to be a general tax, so we're looking for 50% plus 1. Is that correct?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, that's correct.
And so the distinction would be a general tax. It's up to the discretion of the city council how we spend the money, even though it comes from a specific revenue source, in this case, the marijuana businesses.
That is correct.
So my concern is the including crime prevention, police services, and zoning enforcement under state and local marijuana laws. Would that limit our discretion, or are those just exemplary? Is that an exemplary list of places where we could spend the money? Is this but not limited to?
It is exemplary. I don't think we need the but not limited to, although we have the words to put it there. The reason I don't think we need it is that it modifies the phrase general city services. So it is a sub-list, not an exhaustive description of what general city services may be.
Okay, thank you.
And Madam Mayor, if I might, the taxes in the Adult Use of Marijuana Act are effective January of 2018. The initiative itself is otherwise effective after it's been certified by the Secretary of State.
The taxes for the state 15%.
Correct. The state 15% excise tax, as well as there's a cultivation tax based on flower and leaf.
They just, if it passes, they need a year to figure out those regulations. It's just when it will be enacted. So, but this particular proposal, when would the taxation be enacted?
The council proposal in front of you today, the tax would be effective March 1, 2017.
Thank you. Okay. Mr. Hotchkiss?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Do I understand the state's going to have a 15% tax on marijuana legally sold?
That is correct.
So if we enacted the 20%, it would be taxed 35% locally?
That is correct. And Mr. Samario has done an analysis that I think is the last slide in the presentation of comparable, if you can call them comparable, other taxes in this vein, maybe.
Mr. Samario?
Mr. Kalana is referring to what the tax rates are effectively for alcohol and cigarettes, and there's a lot of calculations in there. But essentially, if you go to the far right, what you can see is the effective tax rate, both combined for federal and state. Here in California, for beer, it's 9%. Wine, only 1%. But spirits, meaning harder liquor like whiskey and bourbon and those kinds of things, are taxed effectively at 27%. And then cigarettes are taxed at 52% when you add the federal and state taxes to that per pack amount.
So if somebody's going to sell in the black market, their price could be 35% or 30% under what legitimate stores would be, still give them a 5% profit, so they probably wouldn't cut it that much. But aren't we generating a secondary market here that is exactly the opposite of what we want to do? I don't know to whom I addressed that question. But
Madam Mayor, members of the council, I left that question for the council to figure out as a matter of policy in my opening remarks. I don't know. I really don't know. So I think that's a fair consideration for you to take into account.
Yeah, I think we all do know. I mean, it's a matter of function of price here, so I caution against being too aggressive. Second question I have,
Madam Mayor, if I might, and let me fill out the discussion a little bit. One of the advantages of buying legally distributed marijuana, medical or non-medical, will be the quality control and testing, and meaning you're going to have a product that is free from. Back in the day, we worried about paraquat. So you'll be assured that you have a product of a specified quality and it's safe for consumption. So I don't think it's necessarily a dollar for dollar price comparison for the consumer.
You might be right. I'm not sure that's a great concern these days to people that are out buying pot. How does this, when the federal laws say it's illegal to have legal marijuana, the California law says it's legal, we got two crashing forces here. What's going on? What will happen?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, the Congress, in a bipartisan move, defunded Department of Justice enforcement activities in states where medical marijuana is lawful. So there is no federal enforcement presence in California for medical marijuana.
There's a federal law, but no enforcement.
That's correct. We don't know what will happen with respect to non-medical marijuana.
Okay. Do we have any legal liabilities here that we're not talking about? Either, what do I want to say, prohibitive to a particular product? I guess not, because we could say that to cigarettes. But at one point you said, well, regarding the emergency declaration, we'll basically have to make all this up. That's a quote from you. That seems to me, if somebody wants to challenge it, that leaves us wide open to a challenge, a legal challenge.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, I think there's very limited legal risk. When I said to making it all up, I meant what I was referring to was the enforcement protocols and regulations for how to run these kinds of businesses. Okay. With respect to the emergency declaration, there is no case law defining what that needs to be. So, as I mentioned, I really went overboard with the emergency declaration so that it could pass the test of truth and factual supportability should it be challenged. So I believe it's adequate. There really is no liability to the city deriving from the sale of medical or non-medical marijuana. It's conceivable that in police enforcement there could be an incident that creates civil rights liability. For example, a use of force case that's related to marijuana. That's conceivable. We do know that seizures of medical marijuana have resulted in city liability. So it's my understanding that our police and most of the departments in California are extremely cautious about taking medical marijuana into police custody for fear of invading the property right of the person who possesses it.
Okay. You know, when we say on the emergency declaration that the city does not currently have sufficient funding to meet all of its reasonably known existing and projected future operating capital and reserve needs, then pretty much every city in California could tomorrow make an emergency declaration by that definition. Correct? Would you agree?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, I really don't know how to respond. Honestly, it's kind of rhetorical, so maybe. I don't know. I really don't know whether every city could make that argument. I'm not Santa Monica, Beverly Hills. You know, I have no idea whether that's true.
Okay, that's a fair response. But we've been touting our financial health, I think rightfully so, although we have projections of major infrastructure needs. So, you know, I'm going to go along with this, but it sort of sends a message out like we're desperate and we're in desperate shape. And I don't think we are. We're, relative to other cities, in pretty good shape. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, as a partial response to Mr. Hotchkiss for the questions about that, we are in the South Coast, other than the two that were grandfathered in Goleta, we are the sole owners of dispensaries in the South Coast. We are going to bear a significant burden of enforcement and regulation, and there are going to be significant expenses involved. So in this case, for this reason, I think we do have an obligation to be able to create the funds it's going to take to supplement our enforcement duties and needs. I think when it comes down to enforcement, when it comes into monitoring and especially audit, we're going to have substantial expense. And it's going to be ours because we happen to be the epicenter for the dispensary business, unfortunately, at least in my opinion. In any case, Mr. Colon, if I may, we talked about these two, 10% and 20%, whether it's medical or non-medical. And as I look at, is that because the AUMA is talking about an excise tax on both, but was going to exempt medical from sales tax, so that therefore there is a two-tier situation, or is there a reason to have two rates as opposed to one rate? Because I see all of a sudden medical marijuana, which has been pretty ill-defined up till now, as being all marijuana, if we have a 10% difference in the two.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Rouse, as I mentioned, the city administrator and I had to infer policy from the existing actions of the council. The premise of medical marijuana in California is that it is necessary for the treatment of certain seriously ill people, Compassionate Use Act. But for an oddity of state law, the State Board of Equalization would not now be charging sales tax on medical marijuana. And that oddity is that the exemption requires a physician's prescription. And for whatever reason, when they wrote the Compassionate Use Act in 1996, they only required a physician recommendation. So the state has been collecting sales tax on medical marijuana. AUMA reflects a proposal to the voters to split the tax rate. So the recommendation to split 10 and 20% was an attempt that you may fully reject to distinguish medical from non-medical based on the policies behind the city's prior actions, which were really about helping seriously ill people.
So let me understand, is there now a prescription as opposed to just a recommendation, or is that forthcoming? And how does that jive with the AMA and the federal regulations with Schedule 1?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Rouse, no, there's not a prescription forthcoming. What the state law did in 2015, however, with respect to medical marijuana, is create very strict and new professional liability obligations for physicians who make marijuana recommendations. So the Business and Professions Code that regulates doctors, lawyers, architects, engineers has been amended to require, for example, a physical examination of a patient before marijuana can be recommended. What that tells us about the future is anybody's guess, but essentially the law last year, supported by the League and the police chiefs, was designed to make physicians more professionally responsible when they recommend marijuana. Does this mean the whole world's going to convert to medical? I don't know, but I doubt it.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you for that. I don't want to get too far in the weeds, so to speak, on that, but yeah, that was going to come up. You knew that. You knew that. But yeah, no, yeah. Is this thing working? Okay, I understand that. I guess my only thought is that with a we need to pass some kind of a tax or a proposal to put on the ballot, and I don't want to incentivize everything to become quote unquote medical, since, like I said, it's been such a, even with those definitions, it's still a very, very gray area compared to the rest of the medical world. So I would suggest, and maybe kick around on the colleagues, maybe come up with a rate.
One rate for both medical and non-medical, and figure out what that rate is. And that's what you would, is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Ms. Murillo?
Thanks. I mean, to that point, I like the separation 10%, 20%, Mr. Rouse. But I just did want to remind Mr. Kahlon, and I think you know this, that some people will be selling edibles, marijuana, and so it won't just be straight herb, right? I'm sure you'll take into account businesses that are selling edibles. And I had another point, but I forgot. Thanks.
Mr. White?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, I support charging all the traffic will bear, but no more. And I appreciate the point about creating an underground economy, and we don't want to do that. So I hope that our finance department's math is better than what we're seeing on this slide, but we have 5.5 and 5.5 making 10, don't we? Anyway, that's my policy position on this, and I'm interested in the conversation about where's the sweet spot. I do have one question, and that is the tribal drum of city attorneys and staff members throughout the state. This work must be going on throughout the state as this approaches. Are these the kind of numbers that obviously our numbers are much higher than what's on the books so far? So,
Madam Mayor, Councilmember White, I'll defer to the city administrator on that. Before I do, though, I want to mention something that I neglected to mention to you, and I'm sorry for that. The tax measure, ordinarily an initiative can only be amended by the people. This taxing measure authorizes the city council to amend it if we get new information about different issues. That authorization to the city council includes the power to reduce the tax rate in the future, should you desire to do that, by a vote of a majority of the city council.
So reduce it but not increase it.
That's right.
Okay. So that's like our water rates, for example. We could, right? We put out a notice of Proper 218 about what it could be, but we couldn't implement something higher than the notice. We could put in. Never mind. It's a bad analogy. But Mr. Casey, did you want to add something?
Just, Madam Mayor, this is an evolving field statewide for cities as well. But you've got a dozen or more cities that have adopted revenue measures for marijuana, and the ranges, as we've shown, are anywhere from 5 to 15%. I think, as Mr. Kahlon mentioned in his presentation, most of the cities, when they adopted those revenue measures, didn't have the prospect of non-medical marijuana being legalized in the November ballot. So I'm not sure what percentage they would have chosen if they were thinking of that by differentiating, which is why we're recommending the 20%, but it's just a judgment call.
Okay, so I'm hearing consensus of putting something on the ballot. I guess there's just a question if we want to go with the proposal amounts of the 10 and the 20%, or do we want another number? And I haven't heard a solid. I heard a little solid yes, and then some questions. So we need to make that determination now because we need to finalize this. Ms. Murillo?
May I make a motion that we go with the staff recommendation? See if we have 4 votes for that?
We need 7.
Oh, we need 7. Okay.
So,
okay.
So there's a motion for this to move forward as recommended by this by staff. Is there a second? Second. Okay, second by Dominguez. All right. So to the motion, Mr. Rouse.
Yeah, my argument once again is by dividing the two and to incentivize by market people going to the medical, and so far that has been once again a very shaky definition of what's medical and what's not, and it's going to become a little more unclear as we move away from the collective model into the quote unquote legal model, if that's the case what's going to be. So I would suggest for clarity we just do one amount. I would go at 20% into Mr. Hotchkiss's idea about the black market. Yes, it will exist. Black markets do exist in alcohol, and then one of the biggest black markets in the world is tobacco, frankly. But if we put in the right kind of controls and we have the right kind of taxing mechanism, once again, we are, like if you look at the South Coast, we did stick our finger in the light socket. We have the dispensaries. The rest of the South Coast cities, and I've gone to the League of Cities and talked about this, are looking to Santa Barbara to say, okay, what are these guys going to do? So I think it's important that we get this right. I think we try to generate the revenue we can out of this. Certainly the people who have applied to be dispensary operators and whatnot have gone, whatever, we'll limit our customers, we'll do this, we'll do that. It doesn't seem to matter to them what's going to go on. So the idea that I'm sorry, I mean, there may be people who get benefits from it, but the marijuana is still going to be available in terms of sharing, personal grows, 100 square feet per residence. I mean, it's out there. So I'm not particularly worried about people that need it getting it as opposed to, how we're going to handle this burgeoning industry and I guess the tourism that's going to come from it. I'm not frankly looking forward to it, but we better get it right though, because if we don't get it right, the state's going to say what we're going to do, and we're not going to be happy about that.
Okay, Mr. Hotchkiss.
Just a thought on the what would appear on the ballot. It seems to me if we just say 20% for all marijuana, it's going to ring more bells than if we start dividing it up, and it gets confusing. So if people really want to make this happen, I think from a ballot point of view that the flat 20% is going to be more successful. So if we could I don't know if we can do a substitute motion or what. I don't want to vote against what Ms. Murillo said, but
well, why don't we just hear comments, and if we can ask the maker of the motion if she's willing to amend or not, and we can figure out where to go from. One motion can fail, you can have another motion too. I mean, that's another option.
Anyway, so you understand why I'm saying that, Ms. Murillo.
Right. You're arguing for 20% for medical and non-medical.
Right.
I think I could go for that. But what if another city taxes less, and so people are going to get their product there, and then we don't get the tax revenue?
Well, they're going to have to drive a long way to do it because nobody around here does it.
Plus, we would have the option of reducing the tax number should that happen.
Understood. I think people are going to start growing it more, that, if it's getting normalized, as they say. Okay.
Mr. Dominguez?
Yeah.
No? Yes? Okay. So, no, his light went off. So can we go to the ballot label? You said you wanted to be able to real-time change wording. So if I'm understanding the other proposal would be, it would say, under state and local, okay. So the other suggestion would be, first part stays the same, and then it says, enforcement under state and local marijuana laws at a rate of 20% of gross receipts for medical marijuana and for non-medical marijuana, generating estimated revenues, and then I calculated of between 1.1 million and 2.2 million annually. That would be the change of the wording
You have
there.
to say both medical and non-medical? Why don't we just say marijuana?
Well, I think that part of that is because we don't know if there will be legalized non-medical at this point, because we don't know if the AUMA will pass. If the AUMA fails, we will still be able to tax medical marijuana to 20%, unless I'm missing something, Mr.
Yeah,
Collin.
I don't want to be argumentative, but sorry, I don't mean to debate what you're saying, but if we just said marijuana, it wouldn't matter whether it passed or not; it would be still effective.
So let me ask Mr. Collin, would that be an accurate statement? Depending on what happens with AUMA?
I would identify both medical, or I'd advise identifying both medical and non-medical for this reason. In the future, it would give you the flexibility to reduce the tax, or if state law commands, even eliminate the tax on medical. So I think identifying them separately, both here and as it stands in the ordinance, is more strategic in protecting your future discretion.
Well, that makes good sense.
Okay. Mr. Dominguez.
So just to kind of back out a step, I think my hesitation for either variation is that we might be premature and it might be worth waiting for the feds. I can tell from council votes from before when I was on council that there was a consensus to move forward with medical marijuana, so I don't want to go back in time. But I'm a little worried that we're taxing something that's illegal, and we've kind of got caught doing that before, and it didn't work out great. But given that it looks like this ballot initiative is going to pass, it doesn't make sense to not have a revenue stream that will help us pay for the regulation we're required to pay for. But if there were thoughts along the lines of changing our policy, I'd be glad to talk about that at an appropriate occasion. Regarding the medical versus non-medical marijuana, there are medical forms of marijuana. There's Marinol, which is a prescription drug that people have access to if they want to get their medical marijuana and their THC through a legal regime, and that is tax-free. So I just want to make sure for the record we're advocating that people choose that avenue if it's available to them. And then I wanted to throw out another option. We were talking about adding maybe the but not limited to in terms of our what we're using this revenue to fund. Another option would be to say to help fund any general city services or to help fund all general city services, if that would be more in line with layman's plain language that would be easier to understand and to explain. So I'm just throwing that out there. I'm not necessarily wedded to that, but to avoid having someone try to characterize this as a specific tax. Or to mention the term general police powers, but again, that's a term that sometimes people confuse with general regulatory and health and safety versus actually the police department. So I'm just throwing those suggestions out there.
I'll just respond to that last comment in that all the different sales tax initiatives and everything else we've seen statewide uses that language exactly. And there's never really been a question of whether it was a general tax or a special tax. So when they just say to fund general city services, including blah, 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 that's just been the basic way that it's occurred all up and down the state. So I don't think that's not a problem that's been existing before. So, Mr. Hart.
Does anybody on the staff know what the passage percentages were on the other communities that have taxed medical marijuana? Is it been close, or are they slam dunks?
Madam Mayor and council members, just this last June, there were 4 measures statewide. The 3 of them were general taxes and passed. They were all in the high 60% range. Okay. One measure was a special tax requiring a 2/3 vote. It did not pass, but it got 65% positive support.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I guess I'll go back to the maker of the motion, Ms. Murillo, if you want to.
Madam Mayor, I am willing to go with 20% for both.
Okay.
And I would try to convince my second, Mr. Dominguez, that if you're worried that medical marijuana patients they will be able to get it outside of our city limits. We're just talking about generating revenue to regulate and take care of our own city and our own city services through this taxation. So I'm not worried about that people will grow it, they'll get it from outside the city limits, but it's a revenue source that we need.
Okay, so Ms. Murillo, you are, go ahead, Mr. Kalan. No, you're amending your original motion
Yes,
to
ma'am.
This new language with everything else being the same. And Mr. Dominguez, you were the seconder, so do you agree with that? Yes. Okay, so the seconder agrees with that. Mr. Hart, your light's on. Did you have something?
I do want to just say that I think that there's a risk. I'm going to support the motion, but I think there's a risk here that we are getting too cute and that we are, it is 60% is a nice cushion, but you definitely are going to have probably 40% of the electorate that aren't going to vote for this. And there is some percentage of the electorate who supports legalizing marijuana that doesn't want to pay taxes. And that there's, tacking on this extra revenue thing is injecting risk. Making a distinction between medical marijuana and non-medical marijuana kind of intuitively makes sense to people, and it fits the construct that the voters have already supported. So I'd be cautious about changing the staff recommendation.
Okay. But you're going to, yes, Mr. Kalan.
I would ask Mr. Samario to delicately check your math, Mayor, on the revenue projections.
Please put the right numbers in. I was
think
doing
they're
something
right,
on
but
the fly. So
I don't want...
you don't have to be delicate about it. You can, blatantly check my math. Yeah, please pull the calculator out. We just want to make sure the numbers...
Madam Mayor, one small suggestion. I think it might read more cleanly if it read 20% of gross receipts for medical and non-medical marijuana.
Yep. So take out the 4. The word.
Yeah. So delete the first marijuana and the 20% for, and I think it works.
So 20% of gross receipts for medical and non-medical marijuana and generating estimated. Okay. Okay. Is the math correct?
Put a line through the 4.
Put a line through the 4, F-O-R, after the
20%.
There you go, right there. Mm-hmm.
So the math is correct. It's 1.1 million for each.
Right. So that's how you calculated. Well, and I did that math based on when we had 2 separate rates. So is that still an accurate statement?
So again, just to clarify, so the estimated proceeds for medical and for non-medical each are $5.5 million. Each of them would be taxed at 20%. So it would be $1.1 million for medical and $1.1 million for non-medical. So if you want to express that as a range or an estimate of one number of $2.2 million, I'm not sure how you want to proceed with that.
Madam Mayor, I just want to clarify on that. This is our best effort on trying to discern what the activity level will be at these dispensaries, which are permitted but not open yet. And in fact, the one on Milpas, you put a numerical limit on how many customers it could have. So I think this is probably overly generous in its estimation, but we're just trying to be as fair and equitable as possible.
And we don't know if the AUMA is going to pass yet, so if it fails, then we're just looking at receipts technically really from medical marijuana, right?
That's the 1.1 million.
That's the 1.1 million. So
and
that's the
those
rationale
estimates
behind
have been somewhat discounted from what Mr. Casey indicated about the Milpas dispensary.
Okay. Anything else on the motion? Do we know what the motion is? Okay. Yes.
I'm sorry, Madam Mayor. I also picked up and would include, unless anyone objects, if the mayor includes it, the edit that Councilmember Hart did on recital 10 to add marijuana following the word medical.
Sure. Right. That was to clarify on the rationale behind the emergency declaration. Correct. Okay. All right. So we have the motion. Oh, I'm looking at where's our clerk? She moved. No, you're right there. You're fine. You're fine. You're fine where you are. Okay. All right. We have a motion and a second. All in favor? Aye. And that's unanimous. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. That was a lot of detail and very well described and explained. Okay. Item number 19. When you get here, don't rush.
Item 19, under public hearings, public hearing and adoption of 2015 Urban Water Management Plan.
Thank you. Thank you. Please, hello. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, members of the council. My name is Kelly Dyer. I'm the Water Supply Manager, and I have Mr. Hagmark, the Water Resources Manager, with me today. I'm here to present the 2015 Urban Water Management Plan. And to just give some background and put this, the Urban Water Management Plan into context for what it means to the city, this is a required document. It's required by state law that we submit a report every 5 years. We do this to maintain our compliance and be eligible for state grants and loans. The city has a separate document, which is the long-term water supply plan. Our most recent was adopted in 2011. And the long-term water supply plan really is the city's policy basis for water supply management decisions and long-term planning. And so the long-term water supply plan provides information and feeds into this state report, the Urban Water Management Plan. And we viewed the Urban Water Management Plan as really a snapshot of where we are with our planning. It is a very specific report. There's standardized tables that are required by the state. There's a specific outline that we have to follow. And the state has this long checklist of things that they're looking for to make sure we're complying with the Urban Water Management Plan. Some key elements of the Urban Water Management Plan, it includes water supply and demand projections out 20 years to 2035. This round, a big component was updating the population projections. This is important for our per capita water use targets. Per capita water use targets are the measurement that's used by the state to determine your compliance with the Water Conservation Act of 2009, which is also known as 20 by 2020. What that means is the state has a requirement that overall we reduce our water use by 20% by 2020. And so our per capita water use is used in measuring that compliance. There is a chapter of the Urban Water Management Plan called the Water Shortage Contingency Plan. This outlines considerations that we would take when we are anticipating a water shortage, such as during drought conditions or catastrophic supply interruptions. It provides guidance on the steps we would take to manage that situation, primarily focused on demand management, but there are other things to consider as well. This chart shows the city's 2015 water use metered sales, and I wanted to include this because as we report to the state, it's really important to consider that every water agency has unique characteristics in terms of the type of water customers it has and also the types of water sources that are available. So for the city, we have primarily residential water use. That's the blue and the yellow. Makes up the majority of our water demands. The red is our commercial and industrial water demands. It's about 20% of our total. We have a small amount of agricultural demand, and then the rest we have, for potable water, we have some dedicated irrigation meters which are on water budgets and have specific allocations for how much water they can use each month. And then the recycled water system as well is shown in purple. This chart shows the total water demands for the city going back to 1985, and I wanted to show this chart. It's really fascinating to see how our demands have changed over time. So prior to, this is in the 1980s, you can see our demands were high, around 16,000 acre feet per year. And then this drought was the drought of 1987 to 92 timeframe, and there was a dramatic decline in our demands. After the drought ended, there was a slow recovery, but our demands never really reached where they were before the drought occurred. And this is because we've had a long-term water conservation program that's been in place since the last drought to keep our demands down. And here we are in the current drought. By the way, there's some fluctuations here you see that's primarily due to weather. When we have hot, dry conditions, demands go up, and when it's cool and wet conditions, our demands go down. On average, they stayed about the same. And then this is our current drought. we have reached the demand levels that are about the same as when we were in the last drought, which is, I'm very proud of our community for reducing their demands as much as they have. For the urban water management plan, we project our normal water demands out to 2035. That's what this line here with the X's shows, is our average or our normal water demands over time. And we continue to expect our demands to go down gradually through 2035 with our water conservation program, our normal water conservation measures, even when we're not in drought conditions. This shows our current and projected population. It factors into our per capita water use calculations for compliance with 20 by 2020. And so just wanted to point out we have population projections for the city of Santa Barbara. Mission Canyon is also an area served by the city. It's in the county. It's outside of the city, but outside the city limits, but within the city's water service area. So the total water service area population is to the far right. These numbers were all updated as part of the Urban Water Management Plan to reflect 2010 census data. There was a change of about 500 people from what they were before. It did not affect our targets or our compliance. And so there was a change in the populations. It went up by 500 people, but it didn't have an effect on our per capita water use. So this is measured in gallons per capita per day, and it includes non-residential use. I say that because during the drought, we have been reporting to the state our residential per capita water use, and I didn't want the two numbers to get confused. So for the Urban Water Management Plan, we're reporting our total potable water use. We subtract out agricultural demands because they're focused on the urban water demand. And then we divide that by our population to arrive at these numbers. So for 2015, our target was 123 gallons per capita per day. Our actual water use was much less than that. We were at 102. We had significant reductions in demands during drought, which are reflected in those 2015 numbers. Had we not been in a drought, we estimate our demands would have been about 120 gallons per capita per day under normal conditions, so we still would have met our target. And for 2020, our goal is 117 gallons per capita per day. So we do expect some rebound in our demands from where they are right now. We're at 102, and then we expect there will be some rebound under normal conditions, but we don't expect to have any problems meeting our compliance target. The Urban Water Management Plan has a number of standardized tables where we compare our water demand and our water supplies. All of the information in those tables for our supplies is derived from our 2011 long-term water supply plan. The chart on the left shows our supply mix in our 2011 plan. And at that time, the design drought, the drought of record, was from 1947 to 1952. On the right-hand side, you can see our current supply outlook in the current drought. And we've had much drier conditions than the previous design drought. We're on track to have a new drought of record with the current drought, but we've been able to adaptively manage our supplies based on the policies in the 2011 plan. And so on the right-hand side, you can see we've had additional supplemental water purchases, and we have desal coming on in the 6th year of drought, and really a big difference in our surface water, which the navy blue is our Kachuma allocations, and you can see after the 4th year we stopped receiving Kachuma allocations. So this 2015 Urban Water Management Plan comes every 5 years. It's due in the middle of a drought, and so staff resources have been focused on responding to the current drought. We expect that when the current drought is over, we will be going and updating our long-term water supply plan to take this new data, the new drought of record, rerun modeling analyses, and our long-term water supply plan, and that would be incorporated into our next long-term water supply plan. So we did acknowledge that in the Urban Water Management Plan, that we anticipate having a new drought of record in the next round of reports. So our long-term water supply plan will be eventually updated to incorporate the current drought. We also have other considerations, potential changes to the Kachuma operational yield. This is something we anticipate the Kachuma yield to go down as a result of sedimentation and forthcoming environmental requirements. There's a revised biological opinion coming out for the Kachuma project. And we'll also be reevaluating the future role of desal as we look at the different scenarios of how our existing supply might change. We will look at other potential options, such as potable reuse and groundwater banking. We are currently working on a feasibility study for potable reuse that should be completed by the end of this calendar year. And that's looking at the maximum yield that's technically feasible from potable reuse. And then that information would feed into our future evaluations in the long-term water supply plan. The Urban Water Management Plan really looks at reliability. It's focused on comparison of demand and supplies. But for long-term planning and water resources management decision-making, we look at multiple planning objectives in the long-term water supply plan. So we'll be looking at reliability, costs, water quality, environmental considerations such as greenhouse gas emissions. So all of these other objectives are something we would factor into the policy document of the long-term water supply plan the next round when it's updated. We have a goal to update the long-term water supply plan before the next cycle of required 2020 urban water management plans. And so, if we end up updating, we are looking for the current drought to end before we update the plan. But if that happens, say in 2018, there's no reason why we couldn't amend our urban water management plan, the report that goes to the state at that time. So while we do this every 5 years, there's no reason we couldn't do that more frequently if appropriate. I just wanted to point that out. And finally, wanted to highlight the Water Shortage Contingency Plan, which is a chapter of the Urban Water Management Plan. It provides guidance for drought response. This updated plan still has 3 stages of drought, and some example response measures include public information campaign, water use regulations, water rate adjustments. These are just some examples of things we consider depending on the severity of the drought. The schedule, I will say, has been quite compressed to complete this report. The state released the final guidebook and standardized tables on April 1st. April 21st was a status update to Water Commission, and on April 29th, the draft plan was released for public review. We discussed it again at Water Commission on May 19th. There were a couple of minor comments which have been addressed. And we have received one public comment letter, which we have reviewed and have found that many of those comments will be addressed in our long-term water supply plan update. And some of the comments are reinforcing things that we're already on track to do. So it didn't result in a change in the language or the report to the state, the Urban Water Management Plan report. June 28th, today, we're having a public hearing and proposed adoption, and it's due to the state July 1st. So our recommendation is to hold a public hearing, adopt a 2020 water use target of 117 gallons per capita per day, and adopt the urban water management plan and authorize the Public Works Director to transmit the plan to the State Department of Water Resources.
Thank you. We do have a public comment speaker slip. Why don't we just go right to that? If Kira Redmond, you'd like to come up. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Mayor, Council members. Santa Barbara Channel Keeper has a keen interest in how Santa Barbara manages its water resources, so we appreciate the opportunity to comment on the 2015 update of the Urban Water Management Plan. In an attempt to help Santa Barbara and other South Coast water districts make informed decisions about how to move forward toward more sustainable water supply portfolios, Channel Keeper commissioned a team of master's students at UCSB's Bren School to produce a report, which I've provided you copies of today, that analyzes the financial, energy, and environmental costs of current and potential future water supply options for the South Coast. I hope that you will take the time to review it closely and take its recommendations into account in your future water supply planning moving forward. Just a few comments on the report, on your plan. The city's groundwater is an important resource that needs to be well protected and managed. Channel Keeper strongly urges the city to expedite the modeling effort currently underway with USGS so that we have a clearer understanding of the capacity of our groundwater basins for optimizing conjunctive use, as well as the potential to use them as an environmental storage buffer for indirect potable reuse, or IPR. Channel Keeper strongly supports the increased use of recycled water because it is a reliable local water supply that reduces vulnerability to droughts while also providing environmental benefits. We often hear that there is insufficient demand here, yet recent studies identify numerous opportunities to expand recycled water use in the city. We urge the city to fully and expeditiously expand its production and distribution of non-potable recycled water to all the new customers and locations identified in those reports in its near-term planning. And we also recommend that Santa Barbara be planning now for indirect potable reuse and for direct potable reuse down the road when state regulations are finalized, as many other water districts around you are already doing. On a smaller scale, reuse of gray water is also an unrealized supply potential. The report before you identified reusing gray water could bring us between 500 and 1,500 additional acre feet per year. We also have an unrealized potential with stormwater capture between 226 and 1,000 acre feet per year, and also more gains to be made through efficiency, which are also outlined in the report. And I see I'm out of time, so I hope you'll take a look at it and find it useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you for the report. Okay, that concludes the public hearing, and it's to the council. Mr. Hotchkiss?
Quick question. Was the Channel Keeper letter the one? Okay, so you've already seen that and you've taken that into consideration. Thank you.
Yes. Mr. White?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, this document is an extraordinary work, particularly being done under the shadow of all of the drought efforts that are going on. And I commend staff for pulling this together. It's an informative document. It is something that will help all of us learn about the city system and the range of decisions that need to be made. It's really an impressive piece of work. And I would move the staff recommendation so that this can get submitted to the state.
Okay, moved by White, second by Hotchkiss. Ms. Murillo?
Thank you. I just wanted to ask Mr. Hagmark or Ms. Dyer, just to describe, I think we've had conversations just today, Mr. Hagmark, about stormwater capture being an important part of a strategy going forward. What would, just for the public's edification and ours, what would that look like? That's a huge infrastructure endeavor to take water out of the storm drains before it hits the ocean? What are we looking at if we get serious about that?
Madam Mayor, Council Member Murillo, the stormwater issue is a challenging one, particularly for Santa Barbara's geology. Really, if we can't get stormwater into the ground prior to Oak Park, it really doesn't benefit our groundwater basins. Not to say that it doesn't have a water quality, stormwater quality benefit to get it into the ground further downstream, but based on what we understand now of our groundwater basins, we need to get it into the basin prior to that. So it really limits our opportunities, but certainly Mission Creek is one of the best ways to get water into the groundwater basin, and it's naturally occurring. But there's certainly a lot of money out there. We've been actually talking with the Creeks, our Creeks program, to try and better understand how we might go after it. But it is really tough to get the kind of water, because we get very flashy rains here. It's downpours, super quick runoff. What do you do with it? In ideal situations, you have large spaces where you can slow that water down and let it percolate, and we just really don't have that option. And so it is very difficult here to deal with stormwater in the sense of replenishing our groundwater basins.
Thank you. I'll be supporting the motion, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. Mr. Hotchkiss?
Quick question. On stormwater runoff, is that not something individually houses can do? Capturing it and then putting it in the garden or whatever? Is that one way to approach the problem or the opportunity?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, I'm going to let Madeline Ward, our Water Conservation Coordinator, speak to that.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, that is something that we, as well as the Creeks Division, have been implementing for many years now. That's something that we encourage is for folks to reuse the water that falls on their site rather than using potable irrigation water. So we have a lot of different resources. We have an incentive program for replacing turf with rain swales or drip irrigation native plants in areas to collect rainwater in the soil, as well as one-on-one classes and workshops that we have currently ongoing.
So is that considered a strategy to make better use of stormwater runoff?
Well, we would consider it a demand reduction strategy in terms of offsetting potable water supplies. Right. But as Mr. Hagemark mentioned, there are limited zones within the city where the groundwater recharge would actually boost water supplies.
Wouldn't do that. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Hart?
Well, the only thing I just wanted to add was commenting on Councilmember White's point that staff has done a great job putting this together under the gun to meet the state deadlines and put this all together while the drought's going on and responding to all the pressures that you're under. It's great work. But I am looking forward to the point when the drought ends and we're able to do the long-term water supply planning, because there's been a tremendous amount learned. There's a lot of community organizations that are very invested in helping the city figure out better longer-term supplies of water, and all the things that are in this report that I just briefly got a chance to read the summary recommendations at the beginning are just really exciting. There's lots of opportunity. There's lots of collaboration. I know we're going to be in a leadership role as a city organization because you have done a tremendous job during this drought, but I just want to reassure folks who are worried that this is too status quo today. It is because we can't do anything other than that, given the workload and the time frame and the realities of the situation. So thank you for that.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Great. That's unanimous. Thank you. All right, moving on to item number 20.
Item 20, status of the resource recovery project at Tehugas Landfill.
Great. Mr. Four, whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, Council members. Matt Four, Environmental Services Manager, and we're here to bring you an update on the status of the Resource Recovery Project, something we've brought to you many, many times over the past few years. The most recent update to you was last July, and at that point, we described the benefits of investigating a publicly financed option for this project. Council supported staff's recommendations, so we have taken the past year and really evaluated that. We're here today to give you the results of that analysis and a recommendation for how to move forward. Specifically today, we're going to cover a lot of ground, but we're going to go into a little bit of background, and then we will take you back to the original approach that was contemplated in the RFP that was issued in 2009. For this discussion and moving forward, context is very important, so we'd like to revisit what the original intent was and what the original approach was. We can then go into the public financing approach, talk about what it is, what each agency and entity's roles might be, and then we'll go into reasons for recommending that public financing approach. We'll talk about business terms and price between the county and the vendor. And we'll talk about the city's agreement with the county under this model, which is called a material delivery agreement. And then finally, we'll talk about next steps. So, for background, just to remind everybody, the project is contemplated in the proposal as well as the environmental impact report, consists of a material recovery facility that would process both trash that we currently bury at Tahegas landfill and our current source separated materials like the bottles and cans and mixed commingled recycling. It would recover those. We would then bale those and ship those to market. And all of the waste would go into the MRF. The material that would come out then a portion of that would be organics. That would be food waste, some yard clippings that are in the trash can. Those would then go into the anaerobic digester, which would break down in the absence of oxygen and the presence of bacteria, would then generate methane, or what we call biogas, that would then be burned to produce renewable power. The remaining fraction, about 40% of the incoming material, would still be landfilled at Tahegas landfill. We would just be putting in a whole lot less tonnage than we do now. So a little diagram of what this might look like. The focus here is on the trash can. And everything then that's in our current trash can, everything that we currently dispose of it at Tahegas would go into the mixed waste material recovery facility. Again, 30% of that would come out as organics that would go to the anaerobic digester, and we would make two commodities from that. The first being green energy, and that's the renewable power. The second is a term that we will probably interchangeably use as compost or digestate. And the organic material that goes into the anaerobic digester is a composting process. So compost is the correct word. We will also talk about digestate. That's the solid material coming out of the anaerobic digester and what the potential is for, or what the diversion options are for that material. We would recover about 30% of the material right off the bat through the material recovery facility. That would be the commingled recyclables. That's what's currently trapped in our trash can that we've been unable to get customers to manually separate into the blue container themselves. So this facility, state-of-the-art, would go after those commodities. We would bundle those and bring those to market. And as I said, after we've diverted about 60% of the incoming material, we would still bury about 40% of the material at Tahegas. That 60 to 65% diversion rate, what we're looking at, would extend the site life of Tahegas landfill by about 12 years. The current closure date is 2026, so we're looking at about 2038. So with that as background, we'd like to talk a little bit about the original RFP approach. This is going to be an important point as we compare to the publicly financed option, but to take you back to the original RFP, there were some stipulations that we had in that RFP. The first is that the tipping fee that the vendor proposed would be less than $100 a ton. This is the vendor's service fee. On top of that, there would be some additional costs that would be applied to take care of residual costs related to Tahegas landfill for closure, post-closure costs and things, and that would total about $24. So we were looking at an overall tipping fee of $124, with the vendor's service fee being about $100. The vendor then was to design, build, own, operate, and then transfer the facility back to the county and the public participants at the end of the 20-year term. The vendor would achieve a 60% diversion rate minimum, would generate renewable power. And then another important point, the vendor was really to assume virtually all the risks with financing, with construction, with performance, with commodity volatility and marketing. All of those risks were going to be placed squarely on the vendor under that model. So we did the RFP, we evaluated the proposals, and in the context of shielding the ratepayers from all those risks and putting those on the vendor, and undergoing fairly lengthy negotiations with the vendor and our own due diligence, we came to the conclusion that this approach was going to yield tipping fees that were well beyond that $100 a ton threshold. And the risks that the ratepayers would still end up taking on were probably not prudent to accept. So with that, in July of 2015, we brought that initial conclusion to council, and council agreed that we should go then really examine this public financing option and bring back our results. So again, that's why we're here today. So just to do an initial comparison of these three models, just on the tipping fee component itself, if we look at the first column here, this is the RFP stipulations. So what we were really going after in the RFP was a $100 a ton tipping fee, and the risk burden sat squarely with the vendor. With Mustang, our preferred vendor's proposal, their initial service fee, the closest they could get to achieving the RFP mandate was $121 a ton. But even that $121 a ton tipping fee still shifted a substantial amount of risk back to the ratepayers in the form of guaranteeing commodity revenue, for example, setting a commodity floor. With uncontrollable circumstances, virtually anything that might happen outside of the pro forma assumptions were going to be shifted right back to the ratepayers to make up. So it begs the question, well, what would the real tipping fee be? Under the real RFP scenario, if a vendor were able to truly achieve, we don't know because we were never able to get there. But we know that it would be substantially higher than the $121 a ton. And in that case, the risks would be on the vendor. So then we arrived at the public financing approach. And under that model, and this is what we began to preview with you back last year, under that model, there are three entities involved. The county then would finance and own the resource recovery project. The county would issue the debt. There would be no transfer from the vendor to the county because they would always be the owner. The county would then contract with the vendor, who's undergone a name change, used to be Mustang, now they go by MSB, to design, build, and operate the facility over the contract term. The county would manage the contract with the vendor, and then something we'll talk about a little bit later, the county then, in order to secure the financing, would secure contracts from the participating jurisdictions, including the city of Santa Barbara. And that would secure the financing and would guarantee payment of the bonds and the operating costs. The vendor then, under this new model, the vendor would design, build, and operate the facility. There would be several performance standards the vendor would have to achieve. The vendor would recover the commodities and also market those. Those are the commingled recyclables, the compostable material, the biogas, and then would secure a power purchase agreement through Southern California Edison for the power that's generated. Then the public participants' obligations, this is the city, including the city of Santa Barbara. We would be asked under that material delivery agreement to commit our flow of trash and recyclable materials to the project, or specifically to the county, over the 20-year term, over the 20-year financing term. And that's under a put or pay arrangement. So the put part is we commit to delivering our tonnage. The city currently generates about 73,000 tons of material that would be going to this facility, and we're committing to deliver that amount. That's our historical minimum. We're also committing to pay, and we would pay the county for the city's proportional share of the revenue requirement to operate the facility. It really is translated into a tipping fee, but what the city is really signing up for is, here's our revenue requirement, here's our proportion, and based upon the tonnage that we deliver, we would translate that into a per ton tipping fee. If we ever fail to deliver that minimum amount, we've still covered it in the rates, but we're still obligated to pay that revenue. So with that as a model, now we'd like to get into the reasons why staff supports that public financing approach. And in brief, there are three particular reasons why staff is supportive of that. The first is that the risks that the city would take on under this public financing model are really no different or of no greater caliber than those under Mustang's best attempt approach. And again, as we were going through the original RFP and negotiations, because of the shift to the ratepayers that Mustang was pushing onto us, we were already accepting more risk than what the RFP called for. But we are paying a premium for it. And so, for example, we would ask Mustang to mitigate risk, to cover those risks. And they would do that. They would use many of the same mechanisms to protect themselves that we will employ under this model. But we were paying a premium on it. So for every dollar of protection, for example, that the vendor would provide, we might pay $2 in exchange for that. And so under this publicly financed model, the risks are really no greater. The second reason is that under this publicly financed model, tipping fees are substantially lower. And in comparison to the private financing tipping fee, it's about a 30%, 27 to 30% rate increase or decrease under this approach. The third reason is, based upon our due diligence, all of our evaluations, and independent studies by industry experts, we all have come to the conclusion that this approach is warranted. But to get into these specifically, and we looked at, again, the first reason for support is the risk profile. We looked at 4 areas of risk specifically over the past year, and we'll go into these individually, but we looked at technological risk. We looked at risk to commodity values. That's the volatility that we know we will be exposed to. Risks of problems in marketing the digestate. That's an issue that has come up in the past couple of years. Well, what are we going to do with this stuff that comes out of the anaerobic digester? And fourthly is performance risk. That, what would happen, for example, if the project can just never divert the 60 to 65% of material that we're looking for. So the first category was technology risk. And again, I'm going to keep coming back to the original approach. When we issued the RFP in 2009, the goal of it was to shield the public agencies and the ratepayers from all risks. But all technologies were on the table. I mean, we were talking lasers and pyrolytic, technologies, plasma arc gasification, all these things that weren't in existence in the United States and certainly had never been permitted in California. And now we have selected technologies, though, that are on the low-risk side of that spectrum. So mixed waste material recovery facilities and anaerobic digesters. We feel that in relation to what could have been, what we selected is substantially less risky. But nonetheless, we looked at, what is the risk profile with the technologies that we selected? The first, if we look at the mixed waste material recovery facility, these mixed waste facilities have been around for 2 decades, sometimes even more. Now, they have certainly improved over that time. The original ones, frankly, weren't that good. Now they are quite good. And so we looked at several reference facilities. In no case were they as good as the design that we are choosing to pursue. But they perform very well. The equipment does work. And coupled with the vendor's subcontractor, Van Dyke Bolograph, is the premier material recovery facility vendor in the world. And that's who will be designing, and in some cases, in the initial period, helping the primary vendor to get up and getting everything dialed in. As far as the anaerobic digester, the technology here has been around for many, many years. It's old, but it's proven. We use it at our wastewater treatment plant for the digester, for the sludge digester. We know how it works. The science we understand. In the U.S., it's more common that single-stream organics or or pure organics are used, but we know how it works, and we've seen the gas generation that results. We've also spent considerable time in the field at least one anaerobic digester that is taking organic material straight out of the trash can and doing the exact same thing. And their biogas generation record is even better than their assumptions that they went into. So we covered technology risk. The second area of risk that we examined over the past year was commodity values, specifically recyclables. And this is one that we have experienced, the city has experienced, and every public participant has experienced with volatility. About 75% of the commodity values come from commingled recyclable material. It's a big deal. It's about $9.4 million. So we really wanted to make sure we understood that. But we've also understood volatility, and we've seen it. We've seen it since 2008 when the global markets crashed. We've also seen regulatory initiatives that have driven down the cost, like China's green fence. We saw some short-term dips in that. And frankly, we haven't seen the values today come back up to where they were in 2008. But what are the mitigating factors to that? There is some risk, but one of the things that was noteworthy is we already take on that risk, as I said. And to translate our experience to the Resource Recovery Project, about 40% of the revenues from clean commingled recyclables, we already ride that roller coaster. We're already on it. The Resource Recovery Project, in taking the remaining commodities out of the trash, adds about another 60% of exposure. So then we looked at, well, if that's the case, how can we mitigate that risk of volatility? The first is through a rate stabilization fund. And as we move forward, and if the city does execute these contracts and the county executes the contract with the vendor, we will end up setting up a rate stability fund embedded in the tipping fee that will then be used to mitigate the peaks and valleys of that volatility. In most cases, in all cases, commodities have some value. We've never seen commingled commodities go straight to zero. Some will go down, some will go up. We may see a trend, but in no case do they lose all of their value. And in a lot of cases, it's simply a cash flow issue. It's not a permanent value issue that we're grappling with. The third area of risk that we looked at was that of digestate. And this is something that staff was highly concerned about initially. We thought, well, these organics that come out of the trash can, they go into the digester. We know that anaerobic digestion generates biogas. We know that very well. We see that all over the place. But what's the value of the digestate? What can it be used for? And we were concerned about it. We met with the Community Environmental Council. They were concerned about it, rightly so. But as we look at it, we are fairly comfortable with the digestate for a number of reasons. The first is that of all of the material that needs to be diverted from Tahigas to achieve the 65% diversion, this represents less than 10%. It's a small fraction. So the volume is small. Secondly, though, we went around the state looking for facilities that have been able to successfully develop markets and clean this material up to the point that it can be diverted and used by growers and applied to the land, and meet the new state of California land application standards, which are very stringent. And so we took a trip up to San Jose. That's really the reference facility for us in this area that's doing exactly what we're proposing here. For about the last 5 years, not necessarily as an anaerobic digestion, but there is a company that City of San Jose contracts with that takes organics straight out of the trash. They're doing the same thing. For the first 3 or 4 years, they were aerobically composting that material with all of the same contaminants that we would have in ours. But through very, very good secondary screening, they were able to screen out the plastics, the glass, the rocks, all of those inert materials, clean it up to the point that in the immediate area of their facilities now, they're marketing, and this is a direct quote, every single scrap of organic material that comes out of the digester. And we always had a hunch that screening works. This is not a toxics issue, it's an aesthetics issue. And if you can screen it, you can clean it up. The real consideration is, can we screen it at a throughput rate that is adequate to be able to keep up with the 60,000 tons that we're going to have? And there is now equipment out there that does just that and cleans it up to the point where it looks like dirt. And according to San Jose, they said, when we were developing the markets for this, we started by giving this stuff away, and we would pay the trucking, and we would take it near, as far out as Los Banos from Gilroy, for example. And over the past couple of years, what they've seen is that radius is pulled in, and they're no longer paying trucking. The buyers are now paying the trucking, and they have just recently started to be able to charge a small amount for that material. So that's real market development. And that was another thing we were looking at is there is diversion and then there is market development. And this is true market development where growers now who are seeing the benefits of the water conservation effects, for example, or the soil amendment potential want this stuff. They're not just tolerating anymore, they want this stuff. So that was very good for us to see. We've gone down and seen, even in Oxnard and Ventura area, similar screening devices, things that I haven't seen before, that I didn't even know were on the market anymore or had emerged to the market, that are further refining this material and getting these inner contaminants out. So we're comfortable with it. The second reason why we're comfortable with it is the subcontractor that MSB has chosen, Nursery Products out of San Bernardino County. Their business model is taking all of the biosolid sludge from City of Los Angeles and turning it into marketable compost. So that's an important point because the contractor that will be running this facility is accustomed to dealing with low-grade feedstocks or those that initially might have a stigma in developing markets. They're getting rid of this stuff. They're moving it. And they're moving it legitimately. And that was good for us to learn. So the final area of risk analysis is performance risk. So what happens if this facility just simply fails to meet the performance specs, fails to meet the diversion rate, and additional costs have to be put into the system, either in equipment or people or whatever it might be to meet these specifications. The city's risk manager, Mr. Mark Howard, and the county's risk manager have spent a lot of time together with the vendor going over the construction and performance bonds, the equipment warranties, and a whole number of scenarios to verify that all of these mitigations, these insurance and other mitigations, are sufficient to protect the county and then vis-a-vis the public participants of these performance misses. On the vendor's side, if it's an operator issue, there is an incentive for the vendor to perform, to cure these things. If it's a diversion issue, the vendor is penalized for disposing of more material than the 35% disposal that they're contractually allowed. And on top of that, the vendor is paying liquidated damages daily until this is cured. So we feel like the mitigations in place are appropriate. And finally, the contract between the county and the vendor sets out a very clear compliance plan and allocation of costs to cure these performance deficiencies if they arise. So, I know I've been talking a lot. We said there are 3 reasons why we're in support of this public financing model. The first was the risk profile is acceptable. The second reason is that the public financing model results in significantly lower tipping fees. And again, our original RFP target was $100 per ton. What we have arrived at is, I'll get to this later, but it's around $100 a ton. We've achieved that through this public financing model. One of the reasons for that is we're not paying the private equity or vendor profit that was associated with the private financing. and it makes a big difference. The public debt that we can issue or the county can issue is substantially less expensive capital than the private investment. And as it pertains to the vendor, the vendor, as I said before, they were going to employ the same mitigations that we are currently doing, that we're just not paying the premium on it for those same risk protections under the private financing model. The third reason that we're recommending this approach is the third-party evaluations. As I said earlier, we had two of the top-tier consultants in the solid waste industry conduct a technical and a performance and financial feasibility study on both the mixed waste material recovery facility design, operation, and economics, as well as the anaerobic digester. And their conclusions, the costs are in line with industry standards, the technical plans and the performance specs are indeed reasonable and achievable. So we are satisfied with that. That, coupled with our own fairly extensive due diligence process, gives us confidence. So where do we finally shake out in terms of risk burden and total cost? You saw the first three columns where we were originally looking for $100 a ton. The Mustang proposal, the closest they could come was $121. The real RFP proposal, we're not really sure what that would be, but it would be substantially more than $121. And where we end up, the publicly financed cost under this model is $105 a ton. And I just have to add this. I should have made this more clear in the chart. In the staff report, it says that there is a 30% reduction, right? Well, 121 to 105 isn't 30%. It's because of those additional additive, that additional additive cost for the remaining Tahegas cost that would be applied. So if we take the 121, add $25, the real RFP scenario was 146. The 146 compared to the 105 is really the comparison. This $105 is inclusive of all of those post-closure costs that we would continue to have to fund through the tipping fee. So that's the big difference. And similar to the Mustang proposal, the risk burden, although we feel that we've mitigated the risks, the residual risks that are associated with this model fall to the ratepayer, similar to the privately financed approach. I'm just going to stop here. Any questions on the risk analysis before I go on? Good? Okay. All right. So getting into the business terms and price, I just wanted to give a little graphic here as to how everything would be arranged. Under this contractual arrangement, the city of Santa Barbara and the other participating cities, I just didn't list them all to keep this less cluttered, we would be entering into a contract with the County of Santa Barbara. This is through a material delivery agreement that we'll go into more detail in a second. So our role is to deliver the tonnage and pay our fair share of the cost of operating the facility and paying off the debt. The County of Santa Barbara, the central player here, would issue the debt and own the facilities over the 20-year term. There would be no transfer from the vendor as originally contemplated. And the business terms and price, these are really dictated by this waste services contract between the vendor, MSB, and the county. And so I wanted to just go a little bit into what the high points are of this waste services contract. The term is 12 years. This would be a 2-year construction period for MSB to, from the time of notice to proceed to the time that we actually start taking full-scale waste is 2 years. And once the facility is accepted by the county, then there would be a 10-year operating term, which would leave 8 more years beyond this vendor contract, between the vendor contract and the defeasance of the debt. The vendor's obligations, again, they would design, build, operate. We talked about that before. The county's obligations to finance, to operate the scale house, and to continue to dispose of the 40% residual that would continue to be buried at Tahigas. The waste services contract provides for performance guarantees. There are material throughput guarantees that the vendor has to achieve. There are diversion guarantees, as we said, the 64% or 65%. There are guarantees of electricity sales, and then also there is an important guarantee that the vendor, beyond simply recovering the commingled recyclables, will also achieve a market rate that is in line with industry or with commodity indices. The contract provides for vendor compensation, which we can spend a little bit of time on later, and then it also provides for revenue sharing. And so we have used fairly conservative commodity values for the pro forma, and in setting the $105 tipping fee, we think that they are achievable. But to the extent that we exceed that threshold, which we think is likely over the 20-year term, there is revenue sharing. There is a revenue sharing provision, which is largely to the advantage of the county and the public participants, and the vendor retains about 25%. So we get about 75%. The vendor would take about 25%. So the components of this $105 tipping fee, how would it work? The first is operations, and this is a little counterintuitive, but the vendor's fee, what we will be paying MSB is $5.60 a ton. And that's really not, it just doesn't sound like a whole lot, right? But it's a service fee to accept the material, process it, and send it on its way. The assumption behind this operations tipping fee is that we will achieve our revenue assumptions on commodities. This roughly $12 million in commingled recyclables, gas production, and whatever we can market for digestate will achieve that. Anything beyond those conservative baseline revenue assumptions, there is that revenue sharing between the county and the vendor. And that's really where the vendor's profit lies. So this $5.60 tipping fee is really the difference between the revenue, the commodity revenues, and the costs. This makes up the difference. And so to the extent that the vendor recovers commodities, recovers higher grade commodities, and fetches a higher market price, the vendor can then share in that 25% revenue sharing. And that's really the incentive. The other component of the tipping fee is disposal costs. These are the ongoing costs that the county will incur to bury the waste. There is the lion's share of the tipping fee, the debt service. It's about $60 of the $105 a ton. And then there are these additional divisional costs. These are the costs that are embedded in the current tipping fee at Tahigas. We're paying them now. They cover the county's closure and post-closure maintenance obligation. It's like a pension fund. They need to have 30 years of closure and post-closure maintenance saved up by the time we close Tahigas or they close Tahigas. And it also services the debt on the 2003 expansion of Tahigas. The current tipping fee at Tahigas, effective July 1st, is $87 a ton. So in a couple of days, we'll be sitting at $87 a ton. Under this publicly financed model, we're looking at a base tipping fee of $105. And so if we translate that into, well, what does that mean for a typical customer? To a typical single-family residential customer, it's about $5 a month is our increase.
With that about 20%, a little bit less increase in costs, is that going to have any real effect on our trash stream, if I can put it that way? Because it's more expensive to dispose of.
Mm-hmm. Well, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, it shouldn't, and we are. There are two reasons why we are legally obligated to send whatever Marburg picks up pursuant to our franchise agreement to this facility, and it's going to be rare that somebody will choose an alternate provider. I mean, that Marburg is the most convenient. To translate this into a tipping fee impact, realize that, and we talk about this when we bring the CPI adjustment forward every year for Marburg, that the disposal costs are about 25 to 30% of the customer's bill. So that's why when we go from 87 to 105, you're only seeing, a 13% rate increase net on the customer. So I don't think that would be enough to drive somebody to go outside of the normal system and find a third-party hauler.
Well, and they may offset that with the charges they provide their customers, as it were. In other words, they're just going to up the bill that their customers are paying for tipping.
Right.
Just pass it on, in other words.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So we talked about this is the business terms and price under that waste services contract between the county and the vendor. Now we'll talk about the material delivery agreement between the city and the county. And this is the document that if the city council chooses to opt into this facility or into this agreement, this is the agreement that we would request that the city council approve. So the material delivery agreement, again, the parties are the cities and the county, or in our case, the city of Santa Barbara and the county. The city obligations, we would guarantee our minimum annual payment to the county. And what does that really mean? That means our minimum tonnage commitment of about 73,000 tons times $105, so $7 million plus a year. That would be translated into a tipping fee based on what we expect to deliver. Similar to the tipping fees we pay at Tahigas now, we will build this new tipping fee into the customer rates. There's really no change. We accommodate an $87 a ton tipping fee into the customer rates now at the curbside, and that would simply be changed to $105, and we would generate the rates as a result. The term of the material delivery agreement is 20 years. It matches the debt, the term of the debt financing, the 20-year debt repayment. The key point is that there's no general fund obligation in this case. This is the county is an enterprise fund, or the enterprise fund that would issue the debt here. The city's name would not be on the title or would not be on the debt either. And so there's no general fund risk whatsoever. The benefit to this, the biggest benefit, is that the city would be purchasing a 20-year turnkey waste management solution. And this $105 a ton would give us a known tipping fee for the next 20 years with a known CPI adjustment, and would also give us a very, very high diversion rate that we believe will set us in good position or fantastic position to meet state diversion mandates over this next 20-year term. And so, and then the last piece of this is, we've spent a lot of time here with the county on this really being a turnkey solution, so that no matter what happens, whether there is a casualty from a wildfire or from an earthquake or a performance gap or whatever happens, we're paying $105 a ton. We will hand over our waste to the county, and they will manage it over the 20 years. And that's the reason why we have spent so much time on the risk mitigations through insurance policies and equipment warranties and property insurance, business interruption insurance, boiler and equipment insurance, all those different umbrellas of insurance that would guarantee that we pay $105, we get the diversion, and if there's any problem, the county will continue to manage that. So under the material delivery agreement, what are the potential risk exposures that we do see? What are the residual risks? Well, the first is that the facility doesn't perform. And I broke these into two categories. The first is pre-operation. So this is from the notice to proceed to construct all the way up to acceptance testing. And the way this will work is the vendor will design, build, they'll get to the point, and then we will run waste through the facility, and they need to demonstrate that it performs. And so that's called the acceptance test. So what happens if it doesn't perform? Well, there are construction bonds, and the primary mitigation is a series of construction bonds held by the vendor that are equivalent to the total construction cost. So it's about $99 million to build. Construction bonds equal $99 million. If it never gets off the ground, we have the bonds in place to pay off the debt in total, and we're not left with anything. The second, just the minor note, the vendor's also not compensated until the facility passes the acceptance test. So the vendor is highly motivated to get there as well. The second category is the facility doesn't perform after construction. So it's up and running, we've accepted it, and now the performance falters. We're getting 55% diversion instead of 65%, or biogas generation is less than what we anticipated. Well, in that case, we have equipment warranties, we have boiler and machinery insurance, we also have design flaw insurance. So if it comes back to the original design was flawed, we'd be able to draw on those. The other protection is that the vendor at that point, after acceptance, is incurring liquidated damages and increased disposal costs if it's diversion related. If they're not getting their 65%, they're paying $50 a ton to dispose. The last area of risk is that there's a casualty. The facility is severely damaged, earthquake, flood, fire. What happens then? Our obligation continues to be the $105 tipping fee. The county then would draw on the property insurance that would cover the site, and also the business interruption insurance, because there might be incremental costs to take our waste somewhere else. If Tahigas isn't operational, for example, and we had to go to Santa Maria, or we had to take our commingled recycling back down to Ventura, there's likely going to be some incremental cost above $105 a ton that the county would have to pay in order to manage that material. That would be covered by the business interruption insurance.
Mr. Ford, thank you. Did I read somewhere that if the county, if there's a shortfall in, God, this is so complicated. Like the county will take the risk. But if the revenues are higher, they get the higher amount, and if they're below, they take the risk. Right?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember
I'm not
Murillo,
sure if you said that in the last thing.
there are, I think what you're referring to is the revenue ceiling on commodities, if that sounds like out of the staff report.
Right, it's in the operational phase.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so under that case, so we have built in fairly conservative revenue assumptions for the commingled commodities of about $9.4 million. And we've guaranteed that to the vendor as part of their revenue. So the revenue that the vendor receives is the $5.60 a ton for every ton delivered, but also the minimum commingled revenue of $9.4 million. If for some reason that were to erode, we would make that up through our rate stabilization fund. However, because those revenue assumptions are fairly conservative, we are fairly confident that over that 20-year period, as those revenues exceed that revenue threshold, the county and the public participants receive 75% of that overage. So it's to our benefit substantially for those as those revenues go over that minimum baseline. We take the majority. The vendor gets about 25%.
Thank you.
All right. So where do we go from here? The first item of note is that on July 12th, the Board of Supervisors will consider certification of the final EIR and also approval of the waste services contract with MSB. And I just want to put a little caveat into that. This is the contractual framework that they are approving. It is the contract, but embedded in that contract are 5 or 6 fairly substantial precedents to its execution. So, for example, it doesn't take effect until the county obtains financing. Well, the county can't obtain financing until they have material delivery agreements executed with all of the public participants. We would also need to see the subcontractor agreements between the vendor and its 2 primary subcontractors, Marburg and Nursery Products. So there are a number of high bars that have to be achieved before that waste services contract takes effect. Between June and August, then, we hope to complete negotiations with the county on the final terms of this material delivery agreement. We've been meeting with them in earnest already, but we think that by August we will conclude those negotiations. And then in September, October, we may very well come back with an item for the council to consider being the execution of the material delivery agreement with the county, and then also as a second step, making the requisite findings on the final EIR pursuant to CEQA law. And so that would be the other piece, that concurrent with execution of the delivery agreement would be those CEQA findings. Because of that, one of the recommendations then is that you direct staff to work with the Solid Waste Ad Hoc Committee over these next several months to really dive into the details of this project and the material delivery agreement that we would eventually bring. If this goes according to timeline, then in October or November, the county would secure the financing and issue the debt. We then think that by winter, the county would issue the notice to proceed to MSB, and that would kick off the 2-year construction period for the vendor to erect the facility and improve its operation. By July, then, one of the items that we might be bringing to you is a potential phased-in rate adjustment pursuant to the new tipping fees. So if we're trying to get to $105 a ton, we may ask you to consider a phased-in rate increase to do two things. One is to minimize the overall rate impact, and secondly, so we could build up the reserves in the financing model for our financing pro forma. And with that, then in January of 2019, or roughly around that time, we think that this project would actually begin to commence full-scale waste processing. So I'm almost done. So our basis, like we said, the risks are no greater under this publicly financed model than the private. It results in a significantly lower tipping fee. It's backed by our third-party evaluations. And the last thing that I would draw your attention to is that in 2009, when we started this and we issued the RFP, this was cutting-edge waste management. We were going to divert 65% and get the organics out of the trash stream. It was a good thing to do. Now, in 2016, we have a whole litany of state mandates that are now requiring us to do this. So whereas before we were going to be well ahead of the curve, now we're simply positioning ourselves to meet the state mandates on a whole number of fronts in terms of capturing additional recycling or removing the organic material out of the trash wholesale, which is being considered in a variety of state laws. So with that, I can take any questions.
Thank you. Questions? Mr. Hotchkiss?
I have sort of an off-the-wall question here. Do we know what kind of employment we're looking at when we put this into operation?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, I don't know off the top of my head. It is a mixture of automated equipment and personnel. I could get back to you with the numbers.
It's not going to be big, though. Not a lot of people.
It is much more reliant on mechanized equipment than the older sorting lines, which were very manually intensive. We'll have some stations for manual quality checking, but the majority of it is mechanized.
Well, that was a bravura performance. Congratulations. But I'm glad it's going to the ad hoc committee, I think, now.
That's the recommendation. That's the recommendation, yes.
Right, and I would back that and make a motion that we do.
We have public comment, so before you make any motions, we want to get to that. But any questions at this point? Mr. White.
Thank you. So you referred to the San Jose facility repeatedly in your presentation, and when we had discussed this previously, it had been off limits to tours and such. It was sort of a great big black box. Have you had the opportunity to tour that now? Is that now sunlight has hit that facility and we're able to witness it?
Yeah, Madam Mayor and Councilmember White, I did contact the organics manager in San Jose and was able to arrange a tour for myself and one other person with the county. We did spend the entire day with them. They were very forthcoming. I happen to know the manager for the last 15 years or so, and so I think that helped to get in there. But they were very honest. We asked them over and over and over again, if you were to do this over, what would you do differently? And the good news was many of the things they said, oh man, we would have done this, and this differently. Their design 2.0 is our design 1.0. We've already been able to incorporate those changes into our front end design. They were able to validate that much of the equipment and the sequencing thereof that we have built into our design is what they eventually got around to. So it was a good, it helped to validate some of our assumptions, and it was a good field visit.
Okay, thank you. And then it seemed like there were a fair number or a fair amount of liability that falls on the vendor. And I'm curious, what if the vendor goes broke?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember White, the liability really falls on the county under this project. You know, the vendor has performance guarantees and things that they have to achieve, and there are liquidated damages for failure. But if the equipment just does not work or there is a curing issue, the vendor has the ability to cure those while they're incurring these liquidated damages. If they're unable to do so, eventually the county would be able to default that contract and get a vendor, step in and either cure it or get another vendor who can. So the exposure to the vendor is the $5.60 a ton plus the liquidated damages. The insurance coverages are carried by the county, and they would be drawing upon those.
Okay. Well, we'll have other rounds of being able to discuss this, but that's an area where I'd appreciate hearing something. And then I had asked you to provide figures on the Santa Maria tipping charges. What is the status of that facility, and what are those tipping charges?
I did check on that. The tipping fees are still unknown for Las Flores. That's the new Santa Maria facility. Excuse me. It is permitted. So the regulatory scheme has been completed. They are doing some initial grading, but they have not begun construction in earnest. And I don't know their tipping fees yet. They're still working through the rate setting.
That schedule then for that facility do you know the schedule on that? Or?
It was within the next year and a half or 2 years. It was a ways off.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Ford, you mentioned the I guess state-of-the-art MRF machinery that's coming from Holland, or the vendor over there. And in a previous presentation, you mentioned in part of the hauling contracts, one of our bigger costs are the separate routes that we have to run for the different materials. Are there potentials for combining routes in this new scenario with this new machinery? Is the technology there where we could, as opposed to running 3 domestic routes and 4 commercial routes, of doing combining routes in order to achieve the same outcome, I should say?
Yeah, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Rouse, it's specifically because of this equipment. So I have mentioned to you in the past, we're examining the potential of combining routes, specifically having what we call a wet container of organics, food, and green waste, and a dry container of commingled recyclables and dry trash. It's because of a mixed waste MRF and an anaerobic digester with the follow-up screening that we can even contemplate that. Without this machinery, I would be reluctant to even get off the blocks. And so this facility is really the key that unlocks that potential scenario. As part of our due diligence, we did commission a report through DEI, the MRF evaluator, and specifically posed that exact question. So given this design, what is the potential for the city, for example, to go wet dry? And we asked them, could the diversion rates still be achieved? Would there be any fundamental harm to the revenue assumptions or the diversion assumptions in our pro forma? And they concluded, no, this is feasible.
There's a potential upside
Yes.
once we're.
Mr. Dominguez?
I had the chance to visit the anaerobic digester in Riverside, and it was very impressive technology, and it's good to see how many other cities and municipalities in California are adopting this. The question I have is, this is a 20-year commitment, and it sounds like we wouldn't, under this commitment, be encouraging people to reduce trash production because we're buying it at a certain level that'll stay constant over the 20 years. Is that correct?
Well, that's correct. We will commit a minimum tonnage amount to the facility. The context for that is our minimum is our 20-year historic minimum. We're still at the lowest point of waste generation we've been in the last 20 years. So we didn't even have to look back. From 2008 to 2016, when we saw the global economy fall, we saw our tonnages fall dramatically, and they've never recovered. And so our initial commitment was our real-time, historic minimum. And so I don't know how much more our tonnage would decrease. Economics is, economic activity is generally the biggest driver of waste generation. When the economy is going crazy, everybody produces more. When the economy falls off, people don't produce. And so we were able to capture that economic slowdown, the tonnage associated with that. Where we might see some reductions in tonnage, for example, might be changes in material design, what's called lightweighting. So as cans get thinner, as cardboard gets thinner, that can have some impact on tonnage. The final consideration is that we have given a profile of our waste composition. What is our mixed trash? What is our commingled recycling, and how much organic material? But we have a single tipping fee for that, specifically because we didn't want to be tracking 3 different streams and saying, divert more, use that blue container. Whoa, hold up, we're over. And so we didn't want to be doing that. So we have one tipping fee for all of the commodities, and if material tends to switch containers, we're not at risk for that.
Okay, thank you.
So, as was mentioned back in 2009 when this was put together, this proposal was kind of avant-garde, and now state law has caught up to it. What's to say in another 20 years, if state law becomes more stringent, then what's the how do we adapt to that, and what's the financial risk for that, or new? Because you mentioned new equipment or something else might be needed. Has that been talked about in terms of this negotiation, in terms of how much we're responsible for those new costs?
Well, Madam Mayor, we would be responsible for changes in law. And so if there were a change in law, for example, that compelled us to increase cost, we would pick that up.
Okay.
What that might be, I don't know. I think that we are, in terms of where the state has signaled the diversion mandate is going, we are well ahead of the curve. So I think we've bought ourselves quite a bit of time into that 20 years. If there's a new material, for example, that we have to get out of the waste stream because the equipment is modular enough to where I believe we could make the tweaks to be able to do that. Or we might put a manual picking station in to grab it. But we did ask our consultant, in terms of the sequencing, are we locked into this? Are we... Once it's in, and there are no changes. They said no. There's some areas that are some tight spacing, but this is modular equipment, and we would be able to adapt.
Okay. And can you help me on some time? So we keep talking about a 20-year contract with us and the county, but I'm seeing on page 4 the contract term with the vendor is 12 years.
Right.
Can you? Where do the other 8 years go here? So what happens after the contract term is? I know that it says extend the contract by 5 1-year extensions. That still is 12 plus 5 is 17, right? So
you're correct, and there is a disconnect. We did not make the vendor's contract consistent with the debt repayment. We really were interested in the 10-year operating period. We thought was prudent. And one of the most attractive characteristics of MSB has been its ability to design the facility and to get the permits to get through this regulatory scheme. So we wanted the vendor to complete that process, to build the facility, and then operate it for 10. So that ended up being 12 years. At the end, we do have the option, or the county has the option, to extend up to 5 years. So at that point, the county would either exercise those extensions or may bring in a new vendor or may operate it itself. I'm not sure. But there are some options.
And then between years 17 and 20, what happened? Just who's operating?
There would be another contract to supersede this one.
And then you mentioned permitting, and I was looking at the timeline. I didn't see any space for the permitting. So the county board of supervisors is going to certify the EIR. It's a county project. I mean, I'm sure it's a coastal development permit. Are there any other permits so that's going to happen between now and January?
Well, Madam Mayor, the vendor has been working on obtaining permits for the past 5 years. And so it's not that the vendor will commence work on those. They are, in some cases, already have the permits, and in other cases are very, very close to obtaining those.
In which permits so what are all the permits?
Airboard permits, for example, for the flare, Coupa permit for the hazardous materials, the solid waste facility permit, the waste discharge requirements for the Central Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board. There are several.
So they can get those permits before a certified EIR?
I'd have to defer to the county on that one. I know that in some cases they've already obtained them, and in other cases they're very close.
Okay, but they still need a coastal development permit after the certificate. No?
I don't believe they do.
You're outside the coastal zone. Oh. Wow. Okay. All right. That's that one. I actually had a legal liability question, and I don't know if it's to and thank you for being here. We have representation from the county here, or Mr. Kalan. So the original RFP said it had certain qualifications. It had to be under $100 a ton. It was not publicly financed. All these issues. And I remember I was part of that multi-solid waste jurisdictional task force, whatever it is. And there were 3, I think, proposals that came in. I don't remember if there were other businesses that would have wanted to submit a proposal but decided not to based on the RFP parameters. So we chose Mustang based on what they said they could deliver under the RFP parameters. We are now going wildly away from that to a public financing scenario and more than $100 a ton. So I guess the question is, does that put anyone in any kind of liability based on the original promises made, or when we put out the RFP back in 2009, Mr. Vincent or someone? Yeah.
Madam Mayor, members of council, ultimately that contract is going to be let by the county to the vendor, in this case WSB or MSB. In that case, they are the entity that will be. The county is the entity that's primarily liable for any inconsistencies or irregularities with their contracting procedures. In this case, the county has proceeded under the government code provisions for a design, build, and operate program, as opposed to a typical public works contracting provisions. The best answer I have for you is that the county council himself has reviewed this, and his staff has reviewed their contracting procedures and has stated publicly that he is comfortable with the county proceeding with their contract with Mustang Santa Barbara.
Okay. All right. And then I guess when we get to the subcommittee thing, I'll just have questions about the put or pay scenario, and what does that mean about our current activities, for example, with Engel and Gray and our food scraps, because that is all going to depend on what we're sending to Tehigas versus what we're not sending to Tehigas, and how that all relates to the bigger picture of cost of diversion, right? But that can wait for another day. Okay. Okay, I don't see any other lights on for questions. We do have some public comment. Thank you for your patience. We'll start with Phil McKenna and then Anna Citron. And then I believe Sigrid Wright will be right after you. Jeb, you can bring that up to Mr. Casey. Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Phil McKenna representing the Gaviota Coast Conservancy. And I'm a representative of our fair city, a resident of our fair city. The county will borrow $110 million to build a compost pile. I think this is probably the most expensive such facility in the history of the world. And it may not work. Anna Citron of the Law Office of Mark Shatillo, who represents the Gaviota Coast Conservancy, will have comments as to some of the failures and risks in this project in the 2 minutes allotted time. It's a tall task that I'm giving Anna. Are there alternatives to this proposed project? Sure, and they're simple. You can do enhanced source separation. Don't do a dirty MRF. Why do you want to contaminate your final stream of recyclables? Don't do it in the first place. It makes it much simpler and it makes it much more efficient. And you can compost a quality compost product that will be guaranteed to perform and be acceptable in the marketplace without jumping through all of the hoops that the AD presents in producing such a product. What are the benefits of these alternatives? They're perfected technology. There's no risk in the technology. They're much lower cost. It's simple. There's no risk of failure. It's proven. We can do carbon farming with a quality compost product, a strategy to sequester carbon that is in great demand in our county and for the world. And you can have flexibility to changing circumstances. You're not tied into a 20-year project. This is an important issue for the residents of Santa Barbara, and your decision will be important. So please consider it very carefully. Thank you.
Thank you. Anna Citron.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council members. Anna Citron with the Law Office of Mark Shatillo, representing the Gaviota Coast Conservancy. We're pleased that staff is recommending that the ad hoc committee look at this in greater detail. We think there are a lot of details that do need to be explored more thoroughly. And as in many cases, the devil certainly is in the details here. Based on our own due diligence, which includes research and also consultation with experts in the field, we've concluded that this project poses an unacceptably high risk to ratepayers and ultimately to failing overall. The cost of $122 million will not be borne. The risk associated with that will not be borne by the vendor as initially proposed, but will fall squarely on ratepayers. The rate stabilization fund will only address temporary downturns. And I think the idea that people will not leave the market because of high rates is unrealistic. It may be that residential customers won't, but business customers will. And we're already seeing business customers recognize that their organic waste is actually beneficial. They can make use of that and create their own compost. They don't need to go through this type of facility. And I appreciate Councilmember Dominguez's question about, what are we doing here by mixing everything together, and are we creating disincentives for a truly sustainable solution? Because ultimately, by mixing everything in the brown container, there will be a portion of that will be unrecoverable simply because it's contaminated. It's covered with trash. It won't be able to be sold for as high value in the commodities market, if at all. And there are real concerns about the way the AD will function with this mixed waste stream. And I'm pleased to see that staff has met with the staff in San Jose, because what I've heard is that they've had a lot of significant problems, much higher than expected operation and maintenance costs, and a number of concerns with their process. So I would urge that you take a close look at alternatives, as Mr. McKenna was saying, at looking at enhanced source separation and traditional composting. Thank you.
Thank you. Sigrid Wright will be our final speaker. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor and council members. I'm Sigrid Wright, Executive Director with the Community Environmental Council. And as many of you may know, CEC has a very long history, 45-year plus history of waste management and the energy fields. So we've been tracking this project very closely all along the way. And we raised some concerns to you in January regarding the price of the project, the actual technology, and the lack of experience of some of the vendors. I really appreciate the time that we have spent with both your staff and the county staff over the last few months addressing some of those concerns. And in particular, I feel satisfied with some of the performance requirements and the incentives that have been set up. I also want to say that our concerns really focus primarily on the anaerobic digester portion of the project. We have great confidence in Marburg's ability to run the MRF. And in fact, we support all of the goals of the project. So that includes the extending the life of the landfill, the recovery of the methane, and the recovery of more of the recyclables. So I want to focus actually here on something that Phil brought up, and that is the potential for the project to turn out a final product that could really be of service to the community. And as Matt Four mentioned in his report, the landscape has changed a lot over the last couple of years, both regulatory landscape and the market itself. I spent the morning with about 18 soil specialists and agriculturalists up in the Mid-County, taking a look actually at the material that we received samples from the San Jose facility, and we went through the analysis, the soil analysis. And there are still, I think, a few concerns in terms of our community's acceptance of that material, but I do think that this conversation, this is the right time for this conversation, and I'm looking forward to having that. We've got a potential here in our county to really exemplify what the state is talking about in terms of grabbing organic materials, keeping them from the landfill, turning them into something that can be usable, and then applying them to our agricultural lands, and in particular our rangelands through carbon farming. And in doing so, that becomes a double benefit for the city and counties in terms of carbon sequestration, improving the water holding capacity of soil, and meeting our climate action goals. So I'd like to recommend a couple of things.
You're way over your time, though.
Wait, already?
Huh?
Okay, two quick requests.
Madam Mayor, I'd like to hear her suggestions.
Okay, go
Thank
right
you.
if that's how that
Okay,
works.
thank
Go
you.
ahead. Mm-hmm.
Two quick requests, and that is that as you move into this kind of ad hoc discussion, that we start having an active community conversation about the wet-dry collection as part of all of this, not put it off to the end. I know that there's been a lot of work just to get to this point, but I think these conversations need to come together. And then the second is start to have a conversation with the end users of that digestate or that compost product. And I'm happy to help put some of those conversations together. So thanks for the extra time.
Thank you. Okay, that concludes public comment. Any other comments or questions from council? Mr. Kalan?
Yeah, Madam Mayor, members of the council, I have one small request. On recommendation B, with respect to the Solid Waste Ad Hoc Committee, it would be best under the Brown Act to have a report back date for that committee so there's a fixed life on the committee. Our district attorney has taken an enhanced interest in Brown Act compliance in the last few weeks, so I'm concerned that we want to be very precise about that.
Okay, so from staff, what would be an appropriate report back date?
Madam Mayor, we would request December 31st, 2016.
Okay, by the end of, by December 12/31/16. Okay. Okay, Ms. Maria?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So, Mr. Four, when we talk to the public about the rates are going to go up a little bit, but our driving goal is to increase the capacity or the life of the landfill because once it closes, we'll have to find another place to put our trash, and that'll cost more, and we'll have to transport it farther, with all due respect to the Gaviota Coast Conservancy people. Am I right?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Murillo, that's correct. It's certainly extending the life of Tahigas was our original goal. Coupled with that, what Madam Mayor alluded to, that the regulatory regime has now given us additional incentive to divert that we did not have previously. So I think it's a two-pronged goal.
Thank you.
Mr. Hart?
Well, this conversation has come a very, very long way. I remember, I think it was 15 years ago, then Supervisor Gail Marshall he came back from a trip to Germany with Mr. Schnoop in room 15 and talked about this project in a conceptual way. It has evolved dramatically since that time, and I think it has improved significantly. And I think, we're really close to being at a place where we can go ahead. But I do agree with Ms. Wright that it makes sense, given the history and the time that's been invested to date, that we do finish the conversation about these two items, about the, making sure that local agriculturalists are interested in this digestate as a final product, and to talk to them about the screening process and to the experience with San Jose, and to really, know that that is going to be an option, because ultimately that's really important for the next 20 years of managing our waste stream. And then also to get the buy-in to the advantages and disadvantages of a wet-dry system, as Mr. Ford was talking about. I think that, it is appropriate to have this understood, from cradle to grave, the whole process at this point in time, because we're making a 20-year decision. And I guess part of me is a little bit reluctant to fully commit 100% of our waste stream, because I do think that's a long time, and there may be changes in our total quantities. And I would, if it's possible, I don't know if that undermines the entire underpinning of this financial arrangement, but if there could be at least an understanding of what that would be, to reserve some proportion of our waste stream to give us some flexibility to reduce the quantity that we're asking homeowners. We might ultimately want homeowners to reduce, and they would want to reduce, and we wouldn't want to be tied financially. I don't know where the moving tipping point is in all that equation, but I'd like the committee to look at that issue as well.
Mr. Dominguez?
I'm going to jump on the bandwagon on taking another look at the wet, dry, and enhanced separation. Mr. Hart mentioned a trip to Germany. I was lucky enough to go over there as a college student before the Berlin Wall came down, so a while ago, and they had 6 or 7 different separations in every household. So this is a low-tech solution. It's a very elegant, simple solution. So I'm curious, are we past the point of being able to have that conversation about enhanced separation, or other types of other methods of decreasing customers' bills and increasing the environmental impact?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, could you repeat your question? I didn't catch it.
Okay. The question I have is we have a pretty comprehensive project in front of us, and it's going to be referred out if we pass the council recommendation. But is there still time for a conversation to talk about enhanced separation and wet and dry collection?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, I want to make one key point here on the wet-dry collection. These are mutually exclusive initiatives. So the Resource Recovery Project, the Mixed Waste MRF, and the anaerobic digester, the city could move forward with that project with our current collection regime. The current trash, commingled recycling, green waste, and food scraps collection that we have now. The Resource Recovery Project gives us the additional option, and I would say sometime in the future, of evaluating something like combining containers. But we would really need this infrastructure in place to even evaluate, to finish the evaluation that we've begun on a theoretical theoretical basis on making that happen. So we would need this mixed waste MRF and the anaerobic digester and all the screening equipment that's contained therein to pilot routes, to determine, to verify, for example, that the diversion rate, the commodity values, and all those things remain aligned with our original assumptions, if that makes sense.
So one thing that I'm not sure I understand correctly, sir, when you're saying you need to see the infrastructure in place, are you talking about modeling or actually physically in place?
Physically in place. I'm saying that we as a city, I would not recommend making the change to a wet-dry system before this facility were constructed and up and running in its full capacity.
And so, yeah, that I don't understand, because you're talking about a $120 million commitment before we then decide whether to change course.
Well,
seems like we would want to decide the courses and their consequences before we make that type of commitment.
The wet-dry collection change, this change in collection, is not a diversion initiative. It's because we have this other recycling infrastructure, this mixed waste MRF and this anaerobic digester. Because of that, we are now afforded the opportunity to consolidate containers and drop the cost of collection. It's really a cost savings measure. Because of the infrastructure, it can now handle a commingled stream better than we ever could. And because of that, we can potentially consolidate containers and drop collection costs. And the rationale is, as we increase the cost of processing, we can lower the cost of collection to try to mitigate whatever rate impacts we might see.
So combining the waste can and the recycling can into one would cut down the numbers of trips potentially.
Yes.
And the flip side is the processing is going to cost more.
Yes.
So we can't model that before we actually construct a facility. That's the part that...
Well, we've modeled it. And that was part of the technical evaluation that we had commissioned. The next steps to that, if we were going to implement that citywide, the next steps would be, based on the report that we commissioned, we pilot some routes, we work with the vendor to verify that we're still hitting the diversion performance and the commodity values and all those things, all those performance standards, and then we would turn the key and implement that either in one or all of the sectors in the city. But it's like any other large-scale initiative, it would be prudent to pilot, verify, make some changes, and implement. Either implement progressively or all at one time.
So under the plan you have laid out, we would be combining the trash and the recycling. Not a pilot involved there?
No, not necessarily. It is an option that we are afforded that we don't currently have. So the
and that option's not in this financial model that you presented today.
It's not in that option today. What this proposal stipulates is sorting of our trash can, sorting of our commingled recyclables, and sorting of our or processing of our source separated food scraps in the city's case. That's what this does. And so it still takes a substantial amount of the commingled recycling out of the trash can that's currently entrained in that trash stream that we have not been successful in having customer behavior get to the source separated container. Once we have that, though, once this is built, then we're looking a little bit further and saying, now that we have $100 million of cutting edge infrastructure, are there any other options for us to further reduce the cost of collection, which is the lion's share of the customer's bill? And I believe that we do. But we need to have this built and see how it runs before we make those changes. We did commission a report that looked at the waste composition, looked at how wet might the material be, what would a dry container consist of, commingled recyclables in a Dorito bag, for example, and could the sequencing of equipment that we have designed now under this current proposal accommodate that change? Yes. The answer was yes. Would it fundamentally harm the diversion rate? No. Would it fundamentally alter the commodity values? No. Those were the conclusions of our consultant. So we said, great, because what we were concerned about is that we were going to paint ourselves into a corner in 2016 and say, all right, it's up and running, it's 2019, let's go, let's see if we can do co-collection. Nope, because the sequencing that you put into place 7 years ago disallowed it. And what we verified is we haven't painted ourselves into a corner. And so that's.
So when
that's
you
good.
say co-collection, that's when you're talking about enhanced separation?
That's what I'm talking about, the wet-dry container, combining at the curbside green waste and food scraps into one container, and dry commingled recycling, glass, cardboard, metal, plastic, and dry trash, like chip bags and juice boxes and things together.
So in either system, we'd need a MRF and we'd still need an anaerobic digester?
Absolutely.
And it wouldn't necessarily matter. I know there are different technologies with the digester, but theoretically, you're saying there's different units we could switch out potentially?
Well, it would really, for this change, the crux would really be the material recovery facility. It would be the ability of the screens and the optical sorters and things to recognize the repackaged waste composition and still pick the material off. Whatever's organic that we separate out would still be digested just fine. Whatever digestate comes out would still be screened just fine. So our analysis in this case for this change in curbside collection really focused on the material recovery facility.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we do need a motion. Did you want it? Were you going to, Mr. White? Yeah. Oh,
Well, Madam Mayor, I would move the staff recommendation, and including the specific date for
report date
reporting
back by 12/31/16. Okay, moved by
And
White.
the motion includes the evaluation of the issues that the public spoke about?
Evaluate the project in greater detail, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
and I think we
Just
gave,
wanted
yeah.
to make sure
Yep.
that we're
Yep, we'll
catching
incorporate
that.
those
Okay,
items.
thank you.
Yep. Is there a second? Second by Rouse, motion by White. Okay, all in favor? Aye. Great. Thank you all for a very thorough but necessarily thorough report. Okay, we have item 21.
Item 21, appointments to city advisory groups.
Okay, so just as a reminder about how this works, I'm just going to go through the boards and commissions alphabetically. If there are any nominations, anyone can make a nomination for as many candidates or as few candidates as you'd like. If there are the same number of candidates and slots, we can move by acclamation. If there's more applicants than slots, then we'll go through a roll call to see who gets appointed, and you need 4 votes to get appointed, and if we have split votes, we might have to do a revote. So Sarah hasn't done this before either, right? So it'll be exciting, I promise you that. I guess before the first one, I actually have a question. The Building and Fire Code Board of Appeals, it says that there's one term that's open, but we did get a memo from the chief building official and fire marshal saying that you could appoint as many people as you want. I wasn't sure if our clerk has reviewed this and if that's accurate.
To our understanding, it is.
This is accurate.
This is accurate.
That is accurate.
Yep.
So we could. I don't know if you remember getting this memo from.
Yes, ma'am.
May 4th.
I got it. Yeah.
So it's a memo from May 4th from the chief building official and fire marshal saying that you are allowed to do more than one, and they are fine with all 3, just as a point of information. So with that knowledge, are there any nominations for Building and Fire Code Board of Appeals? Ms. Maria. go
Yeah,
ahead.
I was impressed with all 3 of them, so I would move Maloney, Peterson, and Steenberg.
Okay, you're going to nominate all 3? Okay, so are we good by acclamation to appoint all 3? Okay, so move by acclamation. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay, all right, so that's how that one worked. Okay, then we go on to Community Development and Human Services Committee. Before we get there, I know Ms. Cohen, who is eligible, has also applied for 2 other committees, and I think so. I just wanted to put that information out there, right?
Right, and Madam Mayor, I happen to know that she wants Parks and Rec, and because she has a newborn, she only wants 1 appointment. I know sometimes we appoint people to more than 1.
Okay, so don't give her that luxury of going to more than 1 meeting. So I guess that so just hold off. So we want to maybe hold off on this and see where we end up with Parks and Rec, and if she's not appointed to that, we can go back. Okay, so. And so the next one is Downtown Parking Committee. Are there any nominations?
Nominate Fouch.
Any other nominations?
Madam Mayor, I was unclear if Mr. Scafidi was, it says he's under the incumbent, but he's not an incumbent. Is he an incumbent now of the committee?
No.
Okay.
No, that's just another position he had, I guess.
Okay, got it. Okay.
Nominate Janeway.
I'll nominate Scafidi.
Any other nominations? Okay, so we have one vacancy, 3 nominations. So if we could have a roll call, please, and you vote for one.
Councilmember Dominguez? Councilmember Hart?
Scafidi.
Councilmember Hotchkiss?
Vouch.
Councilmember Murillo?
Scafidi.
Councilmember Rouse?
Vouch.
Councilmember White? And Mayor Schneider.
Fouch. So Fouch has 4. Okay. All right. On to Harbor Commission. There are 2 vacancies. Are there any nominations?
I'm nominate McCray.
Any other nominations?
Sly.
Any other nominations?
Dalton.
Any other nominations? Okay, we have 3 nominations, 2 vacancies. If we could have a roll call, please. And you can vote for up to 2.
Councilmember Dominguez?
That's Sly. Okay, Sly. Okay. You can vote for up to 2 if you want to. You can vote for 1 or 2 or so. Okay, go ahead.
And I'm sorry, Councilmember Dominguez, that was 1 for Sly?
Yeah.
Okay. Councilmember Hart?
McCray and Sly.
Councilmember Hotchkiss?
McCray and Sly.
Councilmember Murillo?
McCray and Sly.
Councilmember Rouse?
Dalton and Sly.
Councilmember White?
McCray and Sly.
Mayor Schneider?
Dalton, Sly. And so both McCray and Sly got more than 4 votes, so they are appointed. Okay. Housing Authority Commission. So there are different categories here, and so why don't we go in the order that's as in the staff report. So the first one for a tenant who's receiving housing assistance from the City Housing Authority. Are there any nominations?
Nominate Sir.
Okay. Any other nominations?
Larson.
Okay. Any others? Okay, if we can have a roll call, you vote for 1.
Councilmember Dominguez? Councilmember Hart?
Sir.
Councilmember Hotchkiss?
Larson.
Councilmember Murillo?
Sir.
Councilmember Rouse?
Sir.
Councilmember White?
Sir.
And Mayor Schneider.
Sir. So Sir gets that. Okay. So tenant receiving housing assistance from the City Housing Authority, 62 years of age. We have Mr. Sir's already appointed. We have. Does anyone want to? Is any nominations for any other applicants?
About Larson by acclamation.
Okay. Is there a second? Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. So Larson gets that category, and then public at large. So we have Mr. Sir and Mr. Larson already appointed. Are there any other nominations for this item?
Jeff Green.
Mr. Green, any other nominations? There a motion by acclamation?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
All right, Mr. Green. Okay, County of Santa Barbara Library Advisory Committee, City of Santa Barbara Representative. Any nominations?
Saley.
Any other nominations? I'll nominate Young. So we have 2 for 1 slot. If there's a roll call, please.
Member Dominguez? Councilmember Hart?
Saley.
Councilmember Hotchkiss?
Young.
Councilmember Murillo?
Saley.
Councilmember Rouse?
Saley.
Councilmember White?
Saley.
And Mayor Schneider.
Young. Okay, so Saley gets that. Library Board, I heard Mr. Del Bello, is that correct? He withdrew his nomination,
Correct.
his application? Okay. So we have 2 vacancies.
Ryan and Young by acclamation.
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
All right. We're over to Neighborhood Advisory Council. We have 4 vacancies, but there are different categories. So there is.
Madam Mayor,
Yeah.
I'd like to nominate Stacy Leiden for the Lower West Side. That's a neighborhood that really does need some representation.
Okay.
And for those of you who don't know, the East Side is represented on the Neighborhood Advisory Council as it is.
Bye.
Oh, God.
It's Teresa, right? Pena? Is she still on it?
No, it's Sebastian Aldana.
There's somebody else, too.
Teresa, not Teresa. God, I can see her face. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, there's a nomination for Stacy Leiden for the Lower West Side neighborhood. Is there? She's the only one eligible for that category. So,
Move by acclamation.
Her name is Anna. Okay.
Second.
Okay. Sorry.
okay. So Stacy Leiden by acclamation. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Any other?
Madam Mayor, is Mr. Dalbell out of this one too?
Yes. Yes. I'm sorry. He did withdraw his application here. Okay. Okay. Parks and Recreation. We've 2 vacancies. Are there any nominations?
What do we have these other things here, Madam Mayor?
Well, Ms. Cohen, I think we were waiting to see if she got appointed, if we wanted to see what we wanted to do with Parks and Rec and then go back to it. So, okay. Any other nominations?
Lesnar Buxton, please.
Okay. Anything else? Is there a motion by acclamation?
Second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
All right. Let's go back. Sorry to. So that means just to close the loop back on Community Development and Human Services. There's we're going to leave that vacant, right? Because we just appointed Cohen, and then on Neighborhood Advisory Council, I think.
Partisan by acclamation.
So I think, and Stacy Leiden was just appointed, right?
Right.
Okay. Okay. Rental Housing Mediation Board, there were no applicants. The Santa Barbara Youth Council, we have.
Madam Mayor?
Yes, go ahead.
May I remind the council that the Youth Council has made a recommendation of Camille Cosio. She's an incumbent, and she would represent at large.
She's also, okay, go ahead.
I'm sorry?
She also goes to San Marcos, so she could represent that item as well.
Right, except the Youth Council is recommending Logan OS for San Marcos High School. And then the other name, Alexandria Marks, is active with mock trial on Monday nights, and the Youth Council are recommending the other students who don't have scheduling conflicts. So there's a memo attached. The Youth Council is recommending the 2, OS and
Cosio?
And Cosio.
Okay.
Making a motion on it?
So do you want to nominate those?
Yes,
two?
ma'am.
You're
Thank you.
nominating Cosio and Marks. Any other nominations?
No, Cosio and OS.
Cosio and OS, excuse me.
Nominate Marks.
Okay. So we have.
For which category? That starts to.
Anyone that we can get.
Well, they all 3 go to San Marcos High School, and all 3 can be a public at large. But we only can appoint 2 because of the way the categories are. So if we're nominating all 3, then I would suggest we just do a roll call, and you can vote for up to 2, and we can decide which is on which category, because it won't really make a difference. Is that
And
okay?
then can the third be a member at large, nominated?
So we have. So if you look, there's one slot open for San Marcos High School, and there's one slot open for a member representing the public at large.
Oh, yeah.
All 3 of them can be in either one, but
Okay.
they're not eligible for the other categories.
Got it.
Okay. All right. So we're nominating all 3. Just can I have a roll call, please? You can vote for up to 2.
Councilmember Dominguez.
All right. We can do him last if you want.
Councilmember Hart.
Boaz and Cosio.
Councilmember Hotchkiss.
Marks and OS.
Councilmember Maria.
OS and Cosio.
Councilmember Rouse.
Cosio, OAS.
Councilmember White.
Cosio, OAS.
Mayor Schneider.
Cosio OAS.
Councilmember Dominguez.
Okay. Okay. So Cosio and OAS are the 2. And that's it.
May I ask,
yes.
Shall we clarify which category they're in?
Oh, what was the recommendation from the Youth Council? Who's in which category?
OAS is San Marcos High and Camille Cosio at large.
Okay, so we'll just do it.
Thank you.
I believe that's everybody. Okay. And we have some, thank you. We survived that. And thank you, everyone who's watching, about applying. We really appreciate your participation. So, any council member committee assignment reports? Ms. Maria.
Thank you. I remembered her name, Anna Soto for East Side. Okay, sorry. The West Side Community Group met last night. That's our neighborhood association. And we had a long discussion about changing the street sweeping hours from 3 hours to 2 because it's 2 hours everywhere else in the city. And I'm really grateful for Christopher Toth, Nick Kabukos, and we had a parking enforcement officer. I forgot her name. And anyway, a lot of city staff were there. I'm so grateful. Cameron Benson and Rick Fulmer, and we had a great discussion. So we're looking at that proposal on street sweeping, and also had, as usual, talked about parking issues on the west side. Thank you to Solstice for having us. I'm not sure I'll dance again. It was so tiring, but really a lot of fun. And then thanks for the city to send me to the League of Cities Advanced Leadership Workshop this last week, and I studied municipal finance, which I know a lot about, but we always need a brush up, right? And people had a lot of nice things to say about our departed chief, Cam Sanchez, because there was some workshops that were on policing, and we were talking about our new police chief. I can't wait to meet her. And so there was some nice things said about our police chief. I was happy to hear it. Our former police chief, happy to hear that. Thanks.
Mr. White.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I attended the COMB meeting, Kachuma Operation Maintenance Board, yesterday. Highlights are that the barge is supposed to be moved tomorrow. It was delayed because of the fire, so they didn't want to disrupt the system while in the midst of that in the midst of the fire. So hopefully, and everything seemed teed up to pull that off. The main strategy that has been on the table for our beleaguered steelhead population was to put it into the so-called stilling basin, which is below the dam. Put them in the steelhead in the stilling basin down there, which needed first to be cleaned of predatory fish. They did a netting of that pool and caught literally thousands of fish, bass and sunfish, and one carp, and they caught so many that they realized that the job was impossible, and I believe that is stopped that whole effort. I think they're going to now go back to another plan. I don't think they know what it's going to be, but some other strategy for holding on to those steelhead as we run out of water up there. And I think those were a couple of the highlights of yesterday. Thank you.
Mr. Dominguez.
I attended the Access Advisory Committee, and Laura Yanez from city staff made a presentation on project updates. Our city attorney made a presentation on the Brown Act, and there were comments regarding trying to update the grant software to make sure that it's access friendly. And we're going to have the emergency services coordinator come speak about what the city is doing in that regard.
This past week, there was a contingent of Montenegrin water polo teenagers through here, and through the KOTOR's Santa Barbara Sister City program. They did a lot of scrimmages and with different teams, and they attended the Solstice Parade and really enjoyed themselves. So that was a great little exchange. I got to meet with them and take a photo with them in the mural room, and there's the picture in the Sister Cities room. I am very short, which we all know, but when you're next to 6'7", 15-year-olds, it really, really highlights that fact. Also on Friday, I want to recognize I attended a reception celebrating the retirement of Lynn Carlson. She, with the YMCA Youth and Family Services, she oversees the program that is with Noah's Acreage, and also at Artisan Court for the foster care youth who live there. And obviously there's a successor, and she's started already, but there was a very nice reception, and just want to wish her well, and I gave a little certificate of appreciation on behalf of the city. So, okay, we have some closed sessions.
Item 22, Subject Public Employee Performance Evaluation, Government Code Section 54957B1, 160.01. Recommendation of the council hold a closed session for public employee performance evaluation under Government Code Section 54951B1, title City Attorney.
Okay.
One more.
Go ahead, one more. You got it.
Item 23, subject conference with labor negotiators, Government Code Section 54947.6, 170.1. Recommendation that council hold a closed session for a conference with labor negotiators pursuant to Government Code Section 54957.6. City designated representatives, Mayor Helene Schneider, Councilmember Randy Rouse, Councilmember Bendy White, Christy Schmidt, Administrative Services Director, and unrepresented employee, City Administrator.
Thank you. And we do not have a session next week, and so we're going to adjourn actually to Monday, the 11th at 1:30 for a site visit at 1417 San Miguel Avenue. Okay, thanks. you.